Planning. And as a reminder, if you haven't already, please be sure to complete the sign-in sheets. We need those if you haven't done it on the way out the door. Members of the audience that want to make a public comment later in the agenda should fill out a public comment card and hand it to one of our staff people. This meeting is being live streamed. In order for those online to hear what is being said in the room, it is critical that we all use our microphones when speaking. Touch the button, and you have to hold the button, by the way, board members, to speak. It doesn't automatically stay on. For those participating Zoom, please keep your microphones muted unless you are called upon to speak. When appropriate to the agenda, we will request comments for those online, and you can indicate your desire to speak via the chat box. With that in mind, Aaron, please call the roll of the Chicago Metropolitan Board members.
Thank you very much. Mayor Bennett.
Present.
Frank Beal. Present. President Brawley.
Present.
Mayor Darch.
Present.
Gary Grasso. Nina
Attending
Idamudia.
by Zoom.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. Nina Idamudia. John Noak. Sorry, Mayor Noak. President Reinbold. John Roberson. Mayor Rodering. Stephen Schaefer. Carolyn Schofield. Ann Sheehan.
Present.
Matt Walsh. And Diane Williams.
Present.
Leanne Redden. And Dr. Kuros Mohammadian. We have a quorum.
Thank you. And you hold it. Due to we also have a member that's online due to illness, and the board will have to vote to allow her to be part of the meeting. So this is Carolyn Schofield. So I will entertain a motion.
So moved, Brawley.
Second.
Diane Williams.
All those in favor signify by vote of aye.
Aye.
Opposed, vote of no. And the motion carries. So Carolyn, you can join us right now.
Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, you want to call the roll of your organization?
Indeed, and good morning, everyone. I would like to call this special meeting of the MPO Policy Committee to order. Aaron, please call the roll.
Thank you. I will ask if the appointed member is not in attendance, will the alternate please identify yourself? I will call the organization, followed by the member's name. IDOT Secretary Osmond.
Here.
CDOT Vig Christian Murphy. CMAP Frank Beal. CMAP President Brawley.
Here.
CTA Dorval Carter. Here. Cook County Sis Killen.
Here.
Council of Mayors Mayor Jeff Schilke. DuPage County Chair Deb Conroy.
Present.
Thank you. FHWA Administrator Snyder.
Here.
FTA Kelly Brookins.
Representing Ms. Brookins, Tony Griep.
Thank you. Illinois State Toll Highway Authority Director Rouse. Kane County Chair Pirog. Thank you. Kendall County Vice Chair Scott Gengler. Lake County Chair Hart.
Present.
McHenry County Chair Bueller. Metra Director Derwinski.
Present.
PACE Chair Kwasniewski.
Present.
RTA Leanne Redden.
Present.
Will County Executive Jennifer Bertino Tarrant.
Here.
Class 1 Railroads Lindsay Douglas. We do have a quorum.
Again, thank you, Aaron. We'd also like to welcome Mayor Gary Grasso, who is now representing DuPage County. Gary can't be at the meeting, but I know he is listening. So Gary, we welcome you to the Board of Directors.
Thanks, Jerry.
I'd also like to recognize Paul Goodrich for his service. Paul recently stepped down from the position of as board member representing the city of Chicago, and we are pleased to have his appointment or the vacancy being filled by the appointment of John Roberson from the city of Chicago. John, welcome to the board.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
For the members of CMAP, you have before you the minutes of the previous meeting. And before I do that, I'd also like to recognize now in attendance Matt Walsh, representing CMAP.
Thank you.
So entertain a motion to accept the minutes of our meeting from June. Is there a motion? Because we have such a large crowd, you have to say who you are.
Second, Noak.
Thank you, sir. Aaron, call the roll.
We actually can do a voice vote.
That's
so-
right. I'm back to doing this real quick. All those in favor signify by a vote of aye. Opposed, vote of no. The motion carries.
Back to normal, 2019. Thank you so much, Chairman. Good morning. We do have a full agenda. Our focus of today's agenda is the plan of action for regional transit. The CMAP board does have a few items of business, and so I will keep my remarks brief this morning here. I just first wanted to congratulate the Illinois Department of Transportation for receiving 2 awards from the Midwest chapter of the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials. The Chicago's Jane Byrne Interchange was honored for quality of life for transit, bikes, pedestrian, and other mobility improvements. I, as a user of the facility, have found it to be extremely helpful in moving through traffic, so congratulations on that. Also on I-55 and Weber Road, the new diverging diamond interchange in Will County won the Technology and Innovation Award category. Secretary Osmond, I just want to thank you for your leadership and to IDOT for driving continued innovation.
Thank you.
I am having to hold the mic down. Excited to announce that CMAP, in conjunction with ComEd and the Respiratory Health Association, is the recipient of a Clean Energies to Communities grant funded by the U.S. Department of Energy and managed by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. This was an incredibly competitive program. We don't know the exact award yet, but CMAP could receive up to $500,000 over the lifetime of the 3-year grant. Participating in this program will also be the National Labs, Argonne, and Oak Ridge, who could also receive up to $3 million for their scenario planning support. This program will allow us to use technical assistance to better understand the types and scales of action needed to reduce regional greenhouse gas emissions and other co-pollutants from the regional transportation network. So together with our partners, that will be helpful in us better informing our work around regional climate action planning, really thinking about leveraging our existing transportation and investment processes to advance action on climate change. Most importantly, we really want to help this region attain its climate goals and produce substantial benefits to the residents here across the region. So we are looking forward to that. Stay tuned. When we have more details, we will certainly be touting this award. And kudos to our team for putting together a very competitive proposal. My understanding is there were only 3 proposals selected nationally. In other good news, CMAP's Logan Square Blue Line Equitable Transit-Oriented Development Plan, ETOD, recently won the American Planning Association's Illinois Chapter Advancing Diversity and Social Change Award. Again, this plan is built on collaboration, community-led solutions that address the neighborhood's displacement and inequities. It uses public transit as a community asset to drive neighborhood vitality in a way that was reflected of the needs of the people who lived in the communities that we worked with. I want to thank the Regional Transportation Authority for their partnership in this work, Elevated Chicago, Palenque Liberating Spaces through Neighborhood Action, Lucha Chicago, Egret and Ox Planning, Kretschmer Associates, 3E Studio, and William Estrada for their participation and support in that program. So lastly, most importantly here, over this past year, we have worked in partnership with each and every one of you, the CMAP board, the MPO policy committee members, our county representatives, our municipal leaders, and others to really shape the plan of action for regional transit, or PART. We also engaged regional stakeholders representing civic, community, business, environmental, and labor perspectives to guide the development of these recommendations through the PART steering committee and working groups. I want to thank them for their expertise and input. I also want to thank the Civic Consulting Alliance and the partners that we have from the Chicago Community Trust for both their expertise and financial support of this project. CCA provided support to CMAP to help structure the subcommittee as required by the legislation and help us think about membership criteria. CCA and its pro bono partners also supported the development of the briefing materials for the steering committee members, and for that we are very grateful. Our gratitude does go out to all of our partners throughout this process, so I want to thank you for being a part of the solution. We wouldn't be where we are today without your help. With that, I will happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, we have a few procurements that we would like to approve for the CMAP board.
Again, thank you, Aaron. We do have a couple of items for consideration of board business items. First is contracts and procurements. There are 3 items to consider, and I will turn this over to Alicia.
Good morning. Good morning, Mayor Bennett, board members, and everyone in attendance. We appreciate your time. We have 3 items on the agenda today. The first item, CMAP periodically conducts household travel surveys to collect travel behavior data to create a comprehensive snapshot of the travel choices made by residents, with the last conducted on 2018 through 2019. It is recommended that the board approve a 3-year contract agreement with 2 2-year renewal options with Resource Systems Group to implement a set of 3 surveys conducted on 2-year cycles to understand how travel behavior in the region is changing in response to the post-COVID environment. The cost for phase 1 of the survey is $1,063,692.10, with an amount not to exceed $2,999,000, $2,999,329.74 for the completion of all 3 phases of the survey. The next item, CMAP is pursuing activities to address affordable housing options in northeastern Illinois to address the systemic imbalance between job centers and where people live. Board approval is requested to enter into a 9-month sole source agreement with 1 6-month option for renewal with DePaul University to deliver data profiles for each jurisdiction. This project will be funded by fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 25 UWP funds for a maximum not to exceed cost of $260,000. The final item, the Cook County Assessor's Office GIS data is available at no cost, but requires a resolution by the board that authorizes the executive director to enter into an intergovernmental agreement with Cook County Assessor's Office to access GSI data for the 2021 tax year. Pending no questions, we ask for CMAP board approval.
I'll entertain a motion, and Chair will entertain a motion to accept or approve all 3 of those items. Are there,
Motion to approve all 3.
moved by Noak, seconded by, those in favor signify by vote of aye. Opposed, vote of no, motion carries. Thank you.
Thank you.
I got it.
Last item of business is the nominations committee Met advisory group comprised of Frank Beal, Mayor Rotering, and Matt Walsh on the nomination of executive committee members. And that nomination recommendation is Chair Gerald Bennett, Suburban Cook, Vice Chair Carolyn Schofield, Collier Counties, Vice Chair Ann Sheehan, City of Chicago, at-large Diane Williams, Suburban Cook, and at-large Mayor Noak, Collier Counties. Are there any questions on those nominations? If not, I'll entertain a motion to approve.
So moved, Rotering.
Second Walsh.
Moved and seconded. Any further questions? If not, all those in favor signify by vote of aye. Opposed, vote of no, the motion carries. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, now we get into the main purpose of this joint meeting of both the CMAP and MPO board for the presentation and discussion of probably one of the more critical things that have happened in this region since we formed CMAP with the consensus of the region going back now almost, 23 years when the congressional hearing was held by Representative Lipinski. And I think at that meeting, it was even suggested back then about the merger of different agencies, whether it was PACE with CTA or Metro with PACE. But I think we are at a moment in time in this region for a very critical decision to be made by the region as to how we go forward. Again, it's taken 23 years to do that. And I think the proven success of CMAP when we merged the Council of Mayors in Nipsey back 23 years ago represents where we are today. CMAP has done incredible things over the region. We have brought what thought couldn't take place, the city, suburban, and Collier counties together on a decision-making process of how we go about land planning and transportation in our region. And I think this agency has proven itself that that can work, that we can work together from all different demographics, geographics, to make this region to improve our quality of life through both the land planning and transportation. And now we have an opportunity to make a very important decision, considering the fiscal cliff that the agencies face today, in how we go forward to not only provide transportation, but to fund it. CMAP was required by the General Assembly to come up with a plan. We are the messenger, and that message is coming from all of us in the region. This isn't an independent decision. It's been a collaboration of information and discussion and recommendations that will go back to the General Assembly when the final vote takes place next month. And as Aaron said, we thank all the participants, both from the private sector, the business sector, the non-for-profit, and certainly governmental agencies to have input into this proposal. And today we're going to make a presentation, final presentation, and certainly a period of question and answers regarding the plan. So with that in mind, Aaron, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Chairman, members of the board, and members of the MPO Policy Committee. Let me just kick us off before I turn it over to staff here. I want to reground us in what we were asked to do. Be bold. Reimagine our transportation system. Focus on ensuring the system is financially viable. Make it stronger than it was before COVID-19. Consider equity, climate change, and economic growth, and center the users of the system. These were the objectives that we set out to achieve as we were directed by the General Assembly. We look forward to sharing the findings with you today and really listening to your feedback. The bill sponsors are here today, Senator Ram Vilivalam and Representative Evadina Delgado. I want to just hand it over to both of them to say a few words here before we get started. Senator? Just as a quick reminder too, you do need to hold the mic down while you're talking.
Okay.
Not on that one.
Good morning. Representative Delgado and I flipped for it, and I lost, so I'm going for first. It's an honor for me to be here. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's great to see so many familiar faces in the room as we embark on this mission, or continue to embark on this mission. I want to make a couple thank yous to begin. First and foremost, I want to thank CTA Blue Line this morning. My wife and I had a date for 25 minutes on the CTA Blue Line. It was peaceful, no 5- and 2-year-old yelling in our background, but it was a on-time ride and everything worked out. So thank you. Secondly, I want to thank all of the service boards and RTA for their work, not only their feedback on this mission, but also their work to implement House Bill 1342 and House Bill 2068 that passed the Illinois General Assembly earlier this year, and the governor has signed. I think that will continue to work our way to where we need to be, and wanted to thank you all for providing the feedback and the progress reports from that. And then I also want to thank the staff that have put this 126-page report together, thousands of hours that have gone into this. It's not easy. This is not an easy topic, and there's a lot of balls in the air that need to be juggled. And so just, can we please give them a round of applause for what they've done to get us to this point? And I'm going to keep my remarks brief because I know there's a full agenda. I just want to reiterate a couple points. One is that I do believe that we all have a shared goal. We want to ensure that we're providing accessible, equitable, transparent, environmentally friendly, safe public transit throughout our region. I also believe that we also understand, all of us, how hard this is. We, as the Illinois General Assembly, will have to go to taxpayers and residents to make the case for additional revenue. And I think we all can agree that they're going to be asking us, what is that additional revenue going to yield? And that's the case that we're hoping to make, as obviously with your guidance and expertise. We are very, very eager to get this report. I make this comment from time to time. Sometimes it feels like we're in a sprint, and then sometimes we have to acknowledge that it's a marathon. We all know that there is a fiscal cliff coming. In some ways, I do believe that this report, the meetings that you all have has been a sprint. At the same time, I do want to acknowledge the fact that we are eager to get this report as the Illinois General Assembly, because we need to have our process take place over the next year to hold hearings and have briefings with all 177 legislators across the state and drill down using what you all have put together to what we can come up with in terms of a solution and a path forward. And so, again, I said I would be brief. I want to reiterate another piece. I think that if you speak to legislators across the region and across the state even, they are willing to tackle the tough conversation of revenue. We know that we need a reliable, safe, environmentally friendly, accessible, equitable, and transparent public transit system. So they are ready. And I think as we have these conversations, we need to make sure that we're reaching out to them as well as to hearing what they are hearing from constituents in terms of the needs in their own districts and so forth. And so I want to be a partner in that. Thank you again for all the work that you all are doing. And I look forward to receiving this report, discussing with my colleagues as soon as possible. Thank you so much.
Good morning, everyone. Evadina Delgado, State Rep in the 3rd District. So the first thing I want to say, and I'm going to repeat a lot of what Ram said, but I feel like you all need to hear it again. So I want to thank the CMAP staff. There have been thousands of hours put into developing what is a true policy document. And I know that when we sent this charge to you, Aaron, you all looked at me and said, "You're crazy. We cannot do this in 1 year." And much like what Chair Bennett said, we haven't been waiting 1 year. We've been waiting to do this for many years. And for the first time, I think that we're actually rooting it in policy discussion because we have taken that time to do it. And I think that that's one of the most important things that we can take away from this. I was here back in 2008, not here and not in this role, but I was involved in the 2008 discussions. And let me tell you, battlefield is probably an understatement. And it was one of those situations where people were throwing around the word doomsday a lot. When I took this job and the people of the 3rd District sent me to Springfield, I said, never again are we going to approach transit like that, because it's too important to the people who live in my district. So from the first day I stepped onto the House floor, I said, transit's going to be one of the issues that I really want to tackle. And this is kind of the first step to getting that done. And so again, I know there's going to be a lot of robust discussion. We have a lot of that coming forward, but this is the first step to making that a really productive conversation. And so I appreciate all of you sitting around the table here, taking a look at this and sending it to us so that we can begin our process in Springfield. Because we know that there's a looming crisis, right? But luckily we have a couple of years to really try to build something that makes sense. We are made to do difficult things. And this is going to be a difficult thing. But I think if you've looked at what the General Assembly has done in the past few years, we don't shy away from having the difficult conversations. We're willing to do it, especially when we're doing it with our constituents, with the people of the city of Chicago, people of Northeastern Illinois, the people of the state of Illinois, centered in that conversation. So I look forward to receiving this from all of you. I appreciate all the work that you're going to put into it and look forward to continuing to work with all of you as we continue this process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Representative Delgado and Senator Villalon for being here today. So as we have been stressing the past 9 months is that transit is about people. Their mobility, their access to schools, to education, to opportunities that can make sure that they have a solid foundation for supporting their families. On2 2050 commits to creating a system that works better for everyone. Transit drives our economy. It makes the state and the region more attractive, a global destination for businesses, headquarters, special events, and local economies across our region truly depend on a strong transit system. It's also about people's health, easing traffic congestion, which is directly tied to us achieving our climate goals. And transit also is about equity, because as we look across the region, the importance of having affordable options for people to move around, to get to the places that they need to go, is crucially important. A 20% cut to operations funds would equate to about a 40% cut in service. If I could have the next slide, please. You know, this realization could mean that over 100 cities and towns across our region no longer have access to their metro, that more than 20 Chicago neighborhoods, 6 suburban communities could lose access to CTA train service, and more than 150 bus routes cut across our region. Again, as you heard, doomsday was thrown around a lot previously. This is even bigger doomsday. And for those of you who know me, who have talked to me, I am a glass half full person, but this future scenario truly concerns me for the future livability and quality of life for people across our region. Next slide. You know, the pandemic truly exacerbated our transit challenges and really changed when and how people rely on transit, but I always like to highlight the fact that 60% of the region's jobs cannot be done remotely. Some even asked if we need to build our transit system back up, but again, as I think about it, that's almost too narrow of a vision that we want to marry ourselves to. We really need to think about a visionary future of transit that works seamlessly, connecting employees to jobs that need to be filled across our region. Next slide. So consider the cost of inaction. Our roads would be in gridlock, not only affecting the quality of life, but lost productivity and billions of dollars in increased costs. Our modeling as we looked out to 2030 found that without mobility provided by the regional transit system, regional drivers would spend an extra 444,000 hours driving per weekday, adding up to about $3.6 billion in additional costs of time related to congestion. And public transit is crucial to reducing emissions. Again, we are currently not on track to meet our greenhouse gas reduction targets. Cuts to service would continue to impact the climate and our air quality. An investment in Northeastern Illinois is an investment everywhere. We are a global center of commerce and tech. We're the 3rd largest metropolitan region. We're the 2nd largest US transit network. Again, our gross regional product is $665 billion a year. That's 75% of the state's regional GDP. And just recently, I know that we were celebrating the fact that 4 of our counties were named best by US Site Selection magazine, thinking about how we really tie our transit system to economic development. Google's purchase of the Thompson Center downtown in the heart of Chicago also underscores the prominence of a tech leader and our unparalleled access to public transit as a key factor in their decision. Again, the list could go on, but I just wanted to highlight here, again, that the bottom line is transit is vital to our economic strength and our competitiveness. Both these bodies approved On2 2050, the region's 30-year comprehensive plan. Again, it guides our decision-making around transportation development, the environment, our economy, and other issues affecting quality of life for our 8.6 million people who call Chicagoland home. It provides a clear vision of what priorities need to be advanced and our shared goals. This plan was created together. It's implemented together with our government partners and our 284 municipalities, our counties, and other stakeholders. So much of what you will hear today is not new, but these ideas don't veer far from the goals of 2050. You know, On2 2050 was definitive. regional success relies on transit. It calls for increased funding to link housing, transit, and jobs to ensure better and more equitable access. It calls for transportation agencies, for counties and municipalities to magnify and enhance their coordination efforts and to take swift action to make the system more competitive. Again, the plan of action for regional transit is consistent, aligned with the region's goals outlined in 2050. It recommends bold policy solutions grounded in sound research, analysis, collaboration, engagement, as we were directed by the General Assembly. Again, the recommendations go farther than solving the looming fiscal crisis, but really reimagine the system that we want and think about how that transformational visionary future is achieved. So with that, let me hand it over to Daniel Como, who's going to start with the recommendations of the system we want.
Thank you, Erin, and good morning to everyone on the board and the MPO Policy Committee. As Erin noted, I'm going to talk through what we've called the system we want. I'm a senior policy analyst here at CMAP, and I have been one of the project managers of this effort over the last year. So the system we want, this is our set of recommendations on how we could actually have a stronger regional transit system. And this set of recommendations, we think, builds on the work that has been conducted in plans like Onto 2050, in work like the RTA strategic plan, Transit is the Answer. It also incorporates feedback that we've heard from the steering committee, from you and your staff, from CMAP's Community Alliance for Regional Equity, from focus groups that we've conducted. We've taken all of that input and tried to develop a set of recommendations about what our transit system could be and could look like with additional resources and investment and reforms. We've covered many of these in prior meetings, and as Erin said, some of them build on things that are in prior plans, but we want to walk through these first before we talk through any potential recommendations about funding or governance, because it's important to keep in mind that those changes are in the service of this bolder system that we want. They're in the service of a system that allows us to have a more mobile, vibrant, accessible, and equitable region. And we know that many of these things are difficult, that they will require hard conversations, but we've also tried to identify a set of recommendations that we think are achievable and are achievable in the next 5 to 10 years, if not sooner, across many of these different themes. So if you go to the next slide, the first set of recommendations in this project really serve as the focal point, which is to focus on transit service. That the primary goal of the PART project is to ensure that our regional transit system can remain robust, strong, and get stronger than it was before the COVID-19 pandemic. And we've heard this as an interest from riders throughout the region, that from the surveys that we've conducted, from focus groups, from CMAP's Community Alliance for Regional Equity, that transit service is the most important thing, that if you don't have a transit system to strengthen, any of the other recommendations won't make the difference that we want. And so the PART report recommends that we fully address the anticipated funding gap that we've been talking about, this looming fiscal cliff, as well as to fund additional investments to run the kinds of service that riders have been asking for, more frequent service throughout the day, on the weekends, and additional investments to connect more regional residents to opportunities. We know that communities throughout the region, the communities that you represent, want more transit. We've heard this from people who want more frequent metro service, who want more pace buses that run throughout the day, who want to be able to ride the CTA on the weekend as often as they can on the weekday. Communities that want more connections to the opportunities that exist throughout our region, and communities that want better and more frequent service to get them to schools, to parks, to the grocery, to the doctor, to see friends and family. This is what transit can provide, and with more resources and a new framework to invest those resources, we can make that possible. The next set of recommendations relate to the region's transit fares, and this is another topic that was called out in the enabling legislation for this report. We know that coming out of the pandemic, fare revenue is going to be a smaller part of the region's transit funding, at least for the near to medium term. But we want to make sure that it remains a stable source of operating revenue, that it's important that if this is going to continue to fund transit, that it remains a stable source that our transit agencies can rely on. So we've paired recommendations about ongoing fare increases that can keep pace with inflation, with new strategies like fare subsidy programs for low-income riders or for the region's youth that can make the system more affordable for those who need it the most. We also see opportunities to fully integrate our region's fare structures across the 3 transit service boards with seamless transfers, coordinated fare structures, and a system that allows users to pick the mode that works best for them, including if they're transferring to and from other complementary modes like the Divvy bike share system or the South Shore Line. We've also identified recommendations about bus service. If we have more bus service, we want to make sure that it is as good as it can be. And so we've identified recommendations around bus priority, things like bus lanes, queue jumps, transit signal priority, as well as the staff and enforcement that would be necessary for riders to actually see those improvements and be able to take advantage of them. We've also heard about the importance of bolstering public confidence in the system. We know that transit, like the rest of our society, is facing some complex issues and challenges, including those that relate to issues like public safety. And we know that solving those is also complex, and that many of the recommendations elsewhere in this report will have an effect. One that we really want to highlight is frequency. We've heard from a lot of riders that one of the things that makes them feel safe, comfortable, and confident using the system is if they know that the bus is going to show up frequently and when it's supposed to. But we also know that there are other strategies, many of which the service boards are already beginning to implement or have been implementing for a while. Things like adding staff presence to the system, things like a transit ambassadors program we could pursue, as well as investments in physical infrastructure like lighting or station renewals or public restroom access that can allow riders to experience the system safely and with dignity throughout the day. Looking to strategies that have a little bit of a longer lead time, we do know that there are critical opportunities to rebuild our ridership base for public transit in the region. We've had some changes to travel patterns that we know have shifted how and when people are moving throughout the region. And so one of the opportunities that we want to highlight in this report is to shift to support Metra's evolution into a new regional rail model where you have more frequent service throughout the day, serving more in different kinds of trips. We're recommending that the state consider how it could support this evolution, thinking about what kinds of investments could be made to support that and to take best advantage of the really incredible rail network that we have in our region between the assets that are owned by CTA, by Metra, by other rail systems. We're also thinking about how we can support that transformation with things like investments in infill stations and how it plays into the larger conversation around freight system planning, given we know that there are many conflicts today on some of these services. We're also looking toward changes in the region's transit supportive land use and development. We want transit to be financially sustainable so that it can continue to provide its critical services to the region's residents and communities. And part of that is what the development context looks like around the region's transit system. So we've identified a set of strategies. Some could relate to the public sector, things like developing on parking lots and vacant parcels that are near transit, as well as private sector actions, things that can reinforce more transit supportive decisions in terms of development patterns throughout the region. And then finally, but certainly not least, we have identified a set of recommendations relating to universal transit accessibility. We know that the transit system has made great strides in improving its accessibility, moving toward the goals laid out in the Americans with Disabilities Act. And we think that there are opportunities to accelerate that work, especially with additional focus and funding to develop and fund a prioritized plan, both for on-system investments like elevators and ramps, as well as the kinds of off-system investments like sidewalks and curb cuts that too often pose an issue for people that are trying to access transit today. We also know that there are opportunities to use new technology to make the system easier to use, and that applies to everyone who uses the system, although there are certainly areas where specific investments can focus on specific barriers. We also know that there are opportunities to strengthen and better support our region's demand responsive service options, and thinking about how we can coordinate and integrate those at a regional county or regional scale, building on models that we've seen already in the region in places like McHenry and Lake counties. And we know that there are critical investments that continue to be made in our region's ADA paratransit services. This is a really critical service. It's federally required, but it also is critical to provide opportunities and mobility to residents who depend on it. And as we think about broader investments in the fixed route system, we need to make sure that the paratransit system has the resources that it needs to provide that service, and that operators like PACE, which recently announced an expansion of the rideshare access program to provide more options to paratransit users throughout the region, that those operators have the resources they need to continue to provide that service at the level that it is required. So thank you. I look forward to your questions later on in today's presentation, and I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Elizabeth Scott.
Thank you, Daniel, and good morning, everyone. I'm Elizabeth Scott, a principal policy analyst at CMAP and a member of the project management team for PART. And I'm here to talk to you all about the very difficult but very critical topic of how we pay for the system that the region wants. So when we began this project, the most urgent thing in the front of our minds was the $730 million that we need to raise by 2026 to keep transit operating and moving forward. But through dozens of meetings that we've had with all of you and people across the region and the research that we've been doing, we've thought more about how we can both meet the fiscal cliff that's in front of us and invest in transit's future to provide the things that Daniel has just described to you. So as we get into this, I'll just say, I think that all of these funding options are supported by technical memos that are available on the PARTS website. So if there's anyone you have questions about, those resources are available. But the big picture piece here is that, yeah, we know that this is going to be hard, but the staff believe that we have brought to you for consideration real ideas that are founded in good public policy. So I want to go on and discuss them with you today, but that there is no one solution that is going to be able to deliver this package of recommendations for us. So it's going to be a conversation about which revenues and which combinations make the most sense for the region to move forward. And our work is the basis and beginning of that conversation, we hope. But in order to have this conversation, the team has spent a lot of time talking with people who have been involved in the transit funding conversation for a long time and trying to understand the context in which our recommendations need to be made. So, as many of you I'm sure are aware, that in the middle of the last century, formerly private transit assets were made public in this region. And since that time, there has been periodic funding crises that have faced the transit system, and I think it would be fair to argue constrained its effectiveness in different ways over time. So when we think about context-sensitive solutions that are informed by history, I think it's important to go back to the last crisis and all the very good work and effort that many of the people around the table today put in, and what it got us, and also what it did not get us. So in 2008, there were some very big but different problems facing the transit system, or in the run-up to 2008. Public revenues for the service boards, for all of them, were not keeping pace with inflation and the growing cost of labor. Paratransit costs were continuing to grow as they are today, and the CTA faced pension insolvency. So the leaders at the time put together a package of solutions that had a lot of successes. They were able to raise new sales tax funds and match from the state. They were able to create the sales tax 2 mechanism and dedicate paratransit costs to it first before monies came forward for fixed route. They identified new funds for CTA from a real estate transfer tax in the city of Chicago, $1.50 on every $500 of value transferred. And the state enabled the CTA to issue pension obligation funds and spin off retiree health benefits in ways that were very meaningful and important for what they had to do at the time. Some issues that remain from that solution set, though, is that the formulas that undergird the sales tax, which were developed in 1983, were essentially unperturbed. And so the formulas that our transit system is funded through today are 40 years old and have been inflexible as our world has changed and our system needs have evolved. And so that issue shows up in a number of ways that are outlined in the report. And as Daniel mentioned, paratransit, while federally required, is quite expensive and a growing cost. This is not to say that PACE is not doing an excellent job. They're doing a terrific job. But as our nation ages and more people need these services, the cost is anticipated to continue to grow. And because paratransit costs come out of the same resources as monies for fixed route transit, the more paratransit costs, the less there is left over for the rest of the system. In 2008, or I guess really in 2007, there was no way for people to know that the bottom was going to fall out of the real estate market in 2008 and struggle in subsequent years. So the real estate transfer tax that was put in place to support CTA in the 2008 package has never really shown up for them, and that has been a continued stressor over the intervening years. And considering the underperformance of this asset, the pension payments that CTA needed to pay on a defined schedule based on the solutions identified in the package, were difficult to meet with the available resources. Next slide, please. Something that has come up a lot in this project and in discussion with you and regional stakeholders is the importance of fiscal stewardship, financial stewardship, and people's interest in the question of whether or not our transit system is efficient, our service boards are efficient, and if there are more opportunities to continue to expand or grow that efficiency. So we've looked at a lot of benchmarks across different measures and different times. And while, more innovation is always possible in anything that anyone does, when you average, this is the green bar, the per vehicle revenue hour cost of the peers of our service boards, they are delivering a lower cost in every category. This data is from 2019, from before the pandemic, but looking at the data that's more recently available, the trends are similar. So, it's our assessment that the service boards are already quite efficient. And when we think about the transit system the region wants and the experience that we want to have for our riders, there may be a question worth asking, are we too efficient in some ways? When we think about investment and what it brings and what it can give for us. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get down to it. The system that the region wants will require investment. The package laid out in the Plan of Action for Regional Transit recommends a transformational investment package supported by $1.5 billion in new public revenue annually. There are also associated capital costs for delivering things like regional rail, new train sets, and so on. And so when we break it down, what is in this transformational package? You'll see the cornerstone of it is a $730 million gap. We have to fill that first. That is absolutely mission critical and in front of the region for 2026. But when we think about what it will cost to build the system we want, the system that can help deliver our goals in climate, economy, and more, then we're talking about $575 million in increased service, including the move towards regional rail, $250 million for fare integration and delivering on a low-income fare subsidy and potentially, programs for our youth. And then on top of that, there's a variety of other things like transit ambassadors, station renewals, more accessibility investments, and so on. And so you can read about all of this in great detail, both in our report and the underlying memos that support the estimates that were made. These are all planning level estimates, but we think that this is the neighborhood of what is required to do what we're talking about. So next slide, please. Working together, with stakeholders and regional representatives of different kinds, we wanted to put forward some kind of philosophical priorities to help frame thinking about how we should think about the funding solutions to deliver on the system the region wants. So these are kind of general purpose that could be true, depending on what leaders decide they want to do on funding. And I want to walk you guys through these now. So the first one, we've heard from folks is very, very important, which is that the transit system itself has a role to play in funding transit through managing fares by raising them regularly to keep pace with inflation, by looking for different efficiencies over time and containing cost growth as we go along. The region expects that transit will continue to display the top of line fiscal stewardship that everyone expects, and that the revenues that come from those measures will be a part of paying for what we need to get done. And more on this in a moment, the state should provide more robust support for transit in Northeastern Illinois. We think there's a lot of room for change here and for discussion to take place. Similarly, more discussion later, stable, dedicated funding is needed for paratransit. This is federally required paratransit, and on top of that, it's the right thing to do for the mobility of our people with disabilities. So, more on that in a moment. And, when we think about trade-offs and alternatives, funding solutions should deliver co-benefits for equity and climate goals. These are not just the region's goals, but the state's goals as well. So when we think about revenue solutions that can add more progressivity to a tax or change the incentive structure around carbon emissions, those are the correct policy solutions to put forward first, we believe, and we outline and discuss that in the report as well. So, and then finally, one of the issues that we've had with transit finance in this region, and I think it's not uncommon across the nation, is that fixes are put in place, but because inflators are not applied to revenues, those revenues lose power over time. So we need to, just like the state raise the MFT and index it to inflation and rebuild Illinois, we should think about, with the new transit funding package that comes together, whether there are appropriate inflators to put into that package as well, so we're not here in another 10 or 15 years, as has been the state's practice for the last 50 years. So these are things to keep in mind. So next slide, please. So when we think about how we structure the funding package, CMAP analyzed dozens of revenues and really brought forward what we think is a short list for discussion and consideration. And to try to make it more understandable, we divided the revenues into 5 categories. So system generated revenues, as I just mentioned, this is the role transit itself can play in funding the system. We have some actions we think the state should take around supporting paratransit and funding the currently mandated free and reduced fare programs that exist in the region. And then finally, the state assesses a service fee on the RTA sales tax that is about $30 million a year that we think it would be possible for them to release. That is something that could be discussed. And then kind of in the areas of greater complexity, we've divided the revenues into both durable sources and diminishing or stopgap sources. In the case of the durable sources, we're talking about things that we think are good policy now and should be safe and sound funding solutions for the region and for transit over time. But given the largeness of the size of the amount of money that needs to be raised and the urgency of the 2026 fiscal cliff, we think there might also need to be some solutions that are good for an interim amount of time, that are good for now, but that should be replaced as the region moves forward towards more transportation finance innovation around things like a road user charge or congestion pricing. And then finally, as I mentioned, some capital investments will be required to support all of the initiatives that we're talking about. So that also is important to consider. So next slide, please. So in terms of how this breaks down, you'll see the system-generated revenue, so that's what transit will do. You'll see the actions for the state, more on that in a second. And then you'll see, durable sources, things that we think make sense both now and in the future. And then we have the transformational investment package. And then we've also put together a slightly smaller one, which we've called meaningful change, which delivers some of what Daniel described, but certainly not all of it. So there's the main one, and then there's the smaller one. And you'll see that the two are the same until we get to diminishing our stopgap resources. And that's really where the size difference comes in. So more on that in a second. Next slide, please. When, I said we're going to talk more about the need for state support in that baseline piece. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but here's a graph to make it perhaps a little clearer. So in 2008, we introduced sales tax the state introduced sales tax for the RTA and said, okay, you have this new resource and paratransit will come off the top. Paratransit will come off the top every year of sales tax to the new resource. And, so starting in 2009, that was taking place. And every year, the sales tax, paratransit share of sales tax 2 has grown. And you'll see in 2021 and 2022, the sales tax jumps up, which is great because the state took action to modernize the sales tax through the Leveling the Playing Field Act. But we think that, you can see paratransit year over year is a growing source of this revenue. Next slide, please. And, when we compare Northeastern Illinois to other regions that have similarly sized transit systems or major city multi-county transit systems, we see that Illinois is proportionally speaking supporting transit the least among them. So we think that there's an opportunity to raise that level of support as well. Next slide, please. And so this is, what happens when we apply the different revenue categories to the actual revenues recommended in the report. So as I mentioned, we've got our system generated revenues. This is what we think it's possible for transit to do to be part of this solution. So that's raising fares over time to keep pace with inflation and working to contain cost growth over time. But no one should be under any illusion that transit can maintain zero cost growth because no one can. It's more about making sure that things are appropriate and reasonable in context of what is taking place. Next piece is the baseline actions. So these are our cornerstone state asks. 1, full funding for paratransit every year. 2, to cover the free and reduced fare mandates that the state currently requires but does not fund, and then remove that state surcharge on the RTA sales tax. And together, we think these actions would raise about $335 million a year. But it would need to grow as the cost of paratransit grows. In the durable sources category, we have another really critical recommendation from this report, which is about expanding the state sales tax base. This is something that CMAP and others have been discussing for more than 10 years. And the story here is that in Illinois, we tax primarily goods and not services. We are not taxing services that even peer Midwestern states like Iowa tax. So it's not, sometimes people will say, oh, you're talking about the coasts, our context is different. Even our peer Midwestern states tax more services than Illinois does. And so as our economy changes, as people's spending has changed, most households are spending more of their money on services than they are on goods. So if we're only taxing goods and people are spending less on goods, then our tax is decaying over time. And that affects not just transit, but also the state, counties, and municipalities that rely on sales tax distributions. So this is, I think, a good opportunity, and we have a great deal of research on this, including forecasting of potential revenues under different service scenarios about what would be possible if the state were to take action to expand the sales tax base. But there are options here, what services should be included? By what process should they be selected? How should they be updated over time? That would be something that would have to be figured out if this is a path that the region and the state wants to take. But we think we've made a good start on it. But so if we were to expand the statewide sales tax base to a broad group of services and extend the PTF match to those new resources, in addition to adding some additional sort of smaller sized regional revenues like expanding parking tax in downtown Chicago and slightly raising vehicle registration fees, we think this could raise $540 million a year and growing, because the revenues would grow with the services, with which, if they are properly calibrated to grow with the economy, should grow over time. Okay, so those are shared between all our packages, but where the differences come in really are about the revenues needed to reach that level of transformational investment, the $1.5 billion necessary to build the system the region wants, and the slightly smaller package, which includes some but not all improvements. So these could be mixed and matched, but the way we put it forward in the report is that you could also, in addition to expanding the sales tax base, raise the RTA sales tax in the region by 0.25% to help support the needs of transit. You could also raise tolls by a small increment on existing tollway facilities. These things could be done fairly quickly. But that's why they're in the diminishing or stopgap category, because we think that they don't necessarily have the best nexus with what we're trying to do from a policy perspective, and that these are things that should be taken out by road usage charge and congestion pricing over time. Another option would be to put a nickel on the motor fuel tax in the region. We think that that could raise somewhere in the neighborhood of $135 million a year for transit. The report also explores opportunities to add a modest payroll tax in the region. These are all things that decision makers can discuss while thinking about what revenue options are most appropriate given everyone's various needs and priorities. But this is what it is, and you can read more about it in the report. Next slide, please. And then finally, as I mentioned, there are some capital costs associated with particularly moving towards regional rail, thinking about a potential role for things like electric trains, updating all of our facilities to meet the ADA accessibility that we would like for them to have, and so on. And so I think that, in the larger package, we're talking about, several $100 million a year, ideally, of capital funds, and so just some less in the meaningful change model. And similar to the operating funds that we were discussing, there's a lot of options for how this could be done, but I'll just call out that the federal government provides a great deal of flexibility about the use of state funds for investments like this. So there may be some opportunities to look there at the flexing of federal funds into the transit system. But then there are other things, as I've mentioned, longer term goals like the movement to a road usage charge, which is just important for transportation finance broadly, as I'm sure many of you in the room, this is top of mind for you as well. But we can think about how we do this kind of as time goes on. But yeah, together, these are the revenue recommendations that the report puts forward. It's not lost on us that this is a great deal of money, and that getting this done is difficult. But we think it's reasonable and founded in good policy. But that's really the connection to the next and the last piece of the report, which is talking about governance. So when we're talking about a lot of money, how it should be monitored, how it should be distributed, and how decisions about it should be made, that really brings us to the discussion of governance and how things like performance measures need to play a role in the decisions that we're making going forward. So, thank you.
Good morning. My name's Amy Lee, Deputy of Transportation here at CMAP. I drew the short straw here to lead the discussion on governance, a very difficult discussion, I know. But if you look at how transit is governed today, you'll recognize that RTA's enabling legislation, practically speaking, has a singular focus on financial stewardship. The statute dictates how funds be allocated to the service boards by formula. The statute also requires a 50% fair recovery to ensure that transit will fund at least half of its own operations. The statute by design creates the RTA to sit outside of the service boards to be financial oversight. And then mainly, the RTA is empowered to set annual budget marks to which each service board must demonstrate a balanced budget. All of these things point back to a singular focus on financial stewardship, and I'd argue even a version of stewardship that favors local decision-making. That's what was believed to be needed at the time. That was 40 years ago, and that's what RTA was designed to do at that time. Since then, the region has evolved, economies have evolved, and our thinking around what we need from transit and what we need the RTA to do has also evolved. So the question that we have before us is, what is it that we believe we need at this time? And do we redesign or re-envision a new regional entity to meet those needs? Next slide. When you look at what was just presented by Daniel and Elizabeth, what we want out of our transit system and how we're going to pay for it, you'll recognize that what we need today in a regional entity is far different than what RTA was originally designed and empowered to do. We want a regional entity that is empowered to lead and guide the service boards on how, when, and where transit runs. We want a regional entity that will lead fair policy so that we can achieve a true integrated fare system, and so that we can consider fair policies that will help maintain transit's long-term financial stability. And we want a regional entity that will establish regional goals and have the authority and the dollars to incentivize the service boards to align with those priorities. In other words, our recommendations here in the governance section are intrinsically linked to the recommendations that were just presented, and sets us up to be unified and committed as a region to deliver on those system improvements and ensure that new funding will have transformational results. We urge you to recognize that we are not recommending reform for the sake of reform today. Rather, we are recommending governance reform that is responsive to how we believe the region wants and needs transit to evolve. So why is it not enough that we just secure the needed funding and just commit to making these improvements? Why is governance reform needed at all? Next slide, please. As I started, RTA has a singular focus on financial stewardship and a version of stewardship that favors local decision-making. When we reflect on common challenges around how we currently govern transit, we see that these challenges are even more evident when we put them under the light of the things that we're hoping to achieve. On service coordination, when we see service board operating plans result in gaps in service today, how will we be effective in making sure that a regional rail plan is successful if there's no way to require coordination of bus connections and other last mile services? On funding allocation, when formulas have systemically tied service boards to underperforming revenue streams, like the real estate transfer tax, how can transit evolve and transform if the RTA's discretion is relegated to compensating for broken formulas? As it relates to accountability, if each service board is responding to their own governing board and their own unique missions as they are today, whose job is it to explain why a customer needs 2 different Ventra cards to ride CTA, Pace, and Metra? Who will be held accountable if we successfully fund but don't deliver on implementing a regional transit service framework? On the matter of state and regional roles, silos that currently exist between transit and roadway hinder funding solutions and hinder planning for roadway-related things like bus priority infrastructure. And then as a final catch-all, when it comes to decision-making, Look, today our region is so fortunate to have the roadways, the tollway with its back office, and a robust legacy transit system that is the envy of many other regions. Put together, our region's overall transit system assets could easily be greater than the sum of its parts. But how will we ever fully leverage these assets for the good of the region if we continue to make decisions in these fragmented ways? These are the sorts of questions and challenges that loom large in the minds of the people that will have to work hard to gain support for significant transit funding. Understanding that these challenges could in fact become the barriers to securing new transit funding, we urge our region to not get caught flat-footed on this. We need to be ready with our best thoughts around how to overcome these known challenges so that we can be more compelling as we make a case for transit. Next slide, please. If you've had a chance to review the draft report, you'll know that we've narrowed down 2 options for structural governance reform that we believe are both viable solutions. And while we anticipate that these 2 options will be subject to subsequent legislative processes, from CMAP's point of view, we strongly believe that regardless of which 2 options is chosen, that what matters most will be making sure that the chosen option will deliver on a set of baseline principles for governance reform that I'd like to walk you through right now. Next slide, please. The first principle is related to how we allocate funds. As I mentioned earlier, most of transit's operating funds are allocated by fixed formula. This makes it hard for transit to respond to changing market conditions. Instead, we need to prioritize regional goals and decision-making. We want funding decisions to be made on performance goals. We believe the regional entity needs to be empowered to set financial goals and set performance standards and metrics based on the priorities of the region. By getting rid of the formulas and granting more regional discretion to the regional entity over how funds should be allocated, the regional entity is empowered with the ability to incentivize operational and capital decisions to align with those regional goals. There's also an opportunity for the region to better delineate between funding for baseline core transit services versus initiatives that reflect transit's need to evolve, such as serving new markets. When we can better demonstrate how funding decisions align with priorities, transit riders can have a greater confidence that we're balancing multiple objectives, and we can also improve transparency for taxpayers. Next slide. Relatedly, we urge that more key functions and decisions be made at a regional level, and that the regional entity be strengthened and empowered to take on these new responsibilities. Right now, each service board is responsible for transit operations within its own jurisdiction and optimizes its respective system accordingly. When we consider major regional initiatives like integrated fares and a plan for regional rail, if we want to successfully deliver on these things, it's necessary for the regional entity to be empowered to take on things like fare policy decisions to improve transfers, set performance measures, prioritize what markets to serve, prioritize capital projects, and weigh in on relevant procurement decisions. These are all functions that are currently handled at the service board level, but would really require a unified vision and commitment at a regional level. Next slide, please. The next set of principles relate to performance metrics. I've mentioned them a lot already, performance metrics, but I can't put too fine of a point on this. Currently, our main regional performance metric is the fare box recovery ratio, right? Because our focus is on financial stewardship right now. While we CMAP believe there is value in keeping this as a performance metric, we want to note 2 things. One, the statutory requirement of maintaining a fare box recovery of 50% is truly at the core of why we're facing the significant funding cliff that we are today. 2, we also believe that other metrics that reflect other regional goals beyond financial stewardship need to be considered, So here we recommend that decision makers reduce the fare box recovery ratio. We also recommend that the regional agency be empowered to look beyond the fare recovery ratio and set updated performance metrics to better reflect broader regional strategies and goals. Next slide, please. The next topic we want to provide some principles around are related to regional board appointments and how the regional board functions. We know this will be a very contentious topic, but the more contentious the topic is, the more important I believe it is for us to offer up some good policy principles. First is design board appointment and voting structures to advance regional progress while building local consensus. Continue to require local support for regional priorities and initiatives, but institute reforms that prevent parochial voting blocks that could challenge and implement regional goals. Next, integrate more regional perspectives to the regional board to balance discussions and prioritize comprehensive regional mobility. Then provide a greater role for the state, especially as it increases its funding support. As I stated earlier, the lack of state involvement has led to a siloing of revenue options and has inhibited broader mobility outcomes across the region's transportation system. As realized by many of our peer regions and their respective states, when our region contributes so much to the state's overall economy, we need the state to come to the table and have a stake in our region's transit too. This is not about us and the rest of the state. This is about us together. Next slide, please. Next, we recommend that the composition of the regional board reflect population, ridership, and funding sources. Determine board representation according to who rides, who funds, who lives, and who does business near transit. We would also urge that appointing authorities look to appoint board members with relevant and diverse experiences. We want transit decisions to meaningfully reflect the diversity of needs across the region. And finally, so that we don't overlook the high impact of transit at the local level, provide avenues for local input, promote ongoing communication with local governments to inform service planning, capital priorities, and policy changes. Next slide, please. So I've established those baseline principles. Let's now talk about the two options that we are recommending for structural reform. Next slide, please. In the past, I presented a different version of this slide to illustrate the range of options that we've considered from the start of this process. I flipped it here to bring greater prominence to the two options that we are recommending. Ultimately, it was assessed that integrating RTA and the service boards into one regional agency has great potential to support the implementation of PART recommendations and to address the historic challenges that I earlier talked about. However, with sufficient provisions and reform, keeping the service boards and strengthening a re-envisioned RTA is also a strong option. CMAP I encourage decision makers to reach consensus on one of the structural reform options and establish an implementation plan for how that approach could achieve those baseline principles of reform. I reiterate that what matters most is achieving those baseline principles. We believe reforms can be implemented within either of those two options and can result in impactful changes to how we govern transit in our region. Let's recap each of these options. Next slide, please. In this option, all functions of RTA, CTA, Metro, and PACE, they would be integrated into a single entity under a single governing board, under a single agency executive. All functions would be unified at a regional level, but you can envision that this entity could be organized according to operating units and service committees that reflect the service boards to recognize the local institutional knowledge that is so important to daily transit operations and service decisions. Additionally, You can also envision a service committee dedicated to paratransit and on-demand services, given the growing prominence of this need. In many ways, this model attempts to take a clean slate approach to governance, making it very clear that there's a hierarchy to decision-making and to ensure that there's a clear, unified decision on different matters. While on paper this concept is more intuitive and easy to follow, this option needs to be planned and executed thoughtfully to avoid unintended consequences. Next slide, please. In this option, we would preserve the 4 entities that we have today, but look to move up key transit functions from the service board level up to a strengthened and re-envisioned RTA. These new functions under the strengthened RTA outlined in yellow would include fare policy, capital planning, more authority over funding allocation, and regional service planning. For fare policy, the regional entity would set fares and transfer policies, select payment technologies, and establish procedures for revenue sharing. With a centralized approach to capital planning and funding now coupled together, the regional entity would prioritize capital funding for the region and plan system expansion and state of good repair projects. As mentioned in the baseline principles for funding allocation, the regional entity would allocate discretionary funding in alignment with regional priorities and plans. The regional entity would also lead efforts with state and federal partners to secure investments in operations and capital. For regional service planning, the regional entity would monitor planning throughout the region to prevent critical service gaps and reduce duplication in service. Also, the regional entity would lead market analyses and develop regional service strategies. The service boards would continue to be responsible for daily operations, day-to-day service decisions, and local service planning. Each entity would also still have its own governing board, but again, we point back to our baseline principles for governance reform and would urge that even under this option, a revisiting of board composition would be a very important consideration. On that note, to close and to repeat, regardless of which of these 2 options, we urge decision makers to focus on achieving the baseline principles for governance reform. After consensus is reached on one of the options for the structural reform, we would recommend that an implementation plan be developed to help achieve the baseline principles for reform. So with that, I know that was very long, but I'd like to turn it back to Erin.
And I think one of the things we want to do, I know that many of you have been taking some notes, thinking about questions that you have. We do want to bring in our steering committee members, co-chairs for the working groups that we had to provide some insights and on the discussions that were had around the table before we get to questions here quickly.
Yes, thank you, Erin. As everybody's getting settled up here, I'm Laura Wilkeson. I'm a senior director and was the executive sponsor of the PART report. We know we have talked at you for a long time, so everybody needs to do a wiggle or a shake in their seat because we have a little more talking to go as we get through discussion. And part of the reason that we're prioritizing this is that as we are used to at CMAP coming to both of these public bodies to have a conversation, this piece of legislation created another public body by creating the steering committee. And as I've had the pleasure of talking to many of you throughout this process, we've really been attempting to look at this with the 3-legged stool as the 3 public bodies of our board, the MPO policy committee, and the steering committee. And so we do think in order to round out the discussion, it's important for these 2 public bodies that will take up this report that you hear from some of the perspectives of those people that sat on the steering committee. And so we've asked the co-chairs to be here today. There are 4 here in public, and there is 1 online. I believe Dan Cronin has joined us online as well, so we'll allow him a moment to speak too. And then additionally, the Eno Center for Transportation, as you know, has joined us for this project as an advisor as well. So we want to make sure that we give the perspectives of the steering committee to these 2 bodies. So I'm going to pass it over again first to Amy, and we'll head down the panel, and then Dan will speak after Derek, and please introduce yourselves and your role in the committee.
Jackie's going to go first.
Oh, great.
Good morning, and thank you all for letting us come and make the case. So as I think about what we did in part and making the recommendation, it really took me back to the Chicago that I grew up in. The Chicago that I grew up in was a Chicago where my father took the L to work every day. We never had a car until we got to be teenagers. And that's, there were 6 of us. So 6 of us going 6 different directions. My mother finally decided that we needed to have a car. So what that meant was that my lifetime, my older sister and I got to explore the city on our own with transit. And we never worried about any kind of schedule, any kind of timeline, because we knew when we got around to the L, it's going to be there. If we wanted to take the streetcar, it was going to be there. If we wanted to take the bus, it was going to be there. This is a time when I discovered those red and white buses. Those were the South Suburban buses that came through Bronzeville, where I grew up. They never stopped, but they used to fly past us, right? And so it took me a while to understand what they were and why they weren't stopping. Now, it also made a difference that it was also a time in Chicago where we never had to go downtown. My mother could take us shopping on 47th Street, and we could get just about everything we wanted. The only time we went downtown was when First Communion, confirmation, graduation, things like that. But growing up, going to school, 47th Street was the only place we had to go. So it made a difference on the south side of Chicago when I was growing up, that we had local economic development, that there were local businesses that provided everything we wanted. I could walk to my doctor's office, I could walk to my dentist's office. It was a very different Chicago. It was a time when most of the jobs were still here in Chicago. We didn't have the expansion of all the expressways, taking people out of the city, taking jobs out of the city, making it impossible for a lot of people who wanted to work to exist without a car. And so, it was a time when, it also gave rise to the work that I do at the Center for Neighborhood Technology. You might be familiar that we did a project on, or actually a tool on housing transportation affordability index, which started to match, because what I realized as I grew up and got into this business, that, the Sunday Tribune was full of the ad space of the Tribune was full of these affordable places to live in far-flung places like Rolling Meadows. I didn't know where Rolling Meadows was, but you could get a cheaper house there, and it looked like it was cheaper to live there than in Hyde Park where I lived. But the costs of getting to Rolling Meadows, if you had a job in Chicago, was more costly when you added it up than staying in Hyde Park and taking the bus downtown. So the relationship between transit and economic development and the ability of people to live locally and to enjoy a quality of life that is not revolved around 4 wheels and thousands of pounds of steel is different now than when I grew up. And so in looking at the recommendation of the system we want, we can't replicate that. Times have changed, and we can't have the changing times that we live in now with our climate problems and all the rest of that, and have the system of yesterday. So we have to move forward. Change is necessary. The world is changing, the city is changing, our environment is changing, and our transit system needs to keep up with that. So, the system we want that we worked on here is an opportunity for us to get to that. We don't have it now. As much as I love transit and I love getting around on transit, and as Dorval knows, I spent 6 years on the board of the CTA, so I know it from that side. I know transit from that side as well as transit as being a user from the time I was knee-high to a duck to now. So we need to go back, not go back, that's the wrong word. We need to reconsider how we serve the people of this community. And I was talking to Melinda earlier, this disabled stuff, I was perfectly able 3 weeks ago, and I tore my Achilles tendon, and now I'm not so able, and I was not smart enough, like Aaron Rodgers, to tear his tendon on the left side, so at least he could drive. Mine is on the right side, so I can't even drive. So I am totally dependent on disability services right now. So, as we were talking about the aging and the increased costs of paratransit, yeah, I believe in that. I can feel it, I can see it. So, we do have to modernize. So I'm going to stop yapping and let Amy share with you some of the things that we've learned from the people who are using the system now, who are dependent on the system now, who can't get around without a system that works. So Amy?
Thank you, Jackie. And thanks for the opportunity to both serve on the steering committee and as a co-chair and to present to you all today. It has been a journey, and I really appreciate CMAP for responding to the myriad of questions we've had. And they've gone deeper every time to help us understand what's happening with the system and what would make it a system that's much more desirable to people who aren't riding it today, to people who used to ride it and haven't come back, and most importantly, to the people dependent on it, serving them in the way that they need and deserve. While the fiscal cliff literally drove us to this table today, we know we can't simply fill the gap and continue with the system we have today, both for reasons that you heard from CMAP and from Jackie, but also just the acknowledgement that in a number of respects, the system is really struggling to meet riders' needs, to meet employer needs. The better and more responsive service we have, the more riders it will attract, the more revenue we will get, and the stronger system will be. So this moment affords us to take a look at how we fund it, to take a look at how we govern it, and really importantly, take a look at what is it, and how do we breathe life into this critical transportation infrastructure in our region. Today, I was on the other part of the blue line than the senator, going through a slow zone and smiling internally as even through the slow zone on the blue line, we're going faster than the cars. And it's just so vital for quality of life and for climate. We also have to keep front and center the reality that if our region's transit system, which we know has suffered through COVID, is significantly weakened further, the brunt of the effects will be felt by the groups least able to afford it, both socially and economically. Seniors, residents of households with low incomes, people with disabilities who cannot drive, and residents from communities of color, people who are using transit every day to get all their needs met. We recently held transportation listening sessions in 6 different communities, and nearly to a person, we heard very real frustrations with bus infrequency, delays, no-shows, overcrowding. I lifted out a few quotes from those. Every minute counts sometimes, so if a bus is late, that can cause me a lot of problems. Someone else said, I don't have money to pay for Uber every time the bus doesn't show up. We were stranded women who sat after church waiting and waiting for PACE service to get home. These rider stories are reinforced by the data, so if you're like me and read all the reports, you'll see some data in there that expose where we're at on service levels. Our overall transit service levels just prior to COVID and today are much lower than they were 15 or 16 years ago. CTA bus service is down about 30%, PACE about 8%, and riders are feeling it and are being hurt by it, and so are businesses and employers. In those listening sessions, riders pinpointed a number of improvements that will improve their mobility and their access to jobs and healthcare, and stated things really clearly and definitively like reliability, faster travel, more frequency, better connectivity across the service types and across modes, simpler fares, and more evening service. I'll just share a few more quotes to wrap up. Many people who don't work in the city. Got to take CTA to Pace. Distance is hard. We need better connections to jobs in the suburbs. Pretty much need a car at this point for suburban jobs right now. Pace schedules are real funny and may not get us close to the job site. Metro's not even an option that can be considered for me. We need more 24-hour buses to support the late shift. Otherwise, we're spending a lot of money on Lyfts and Ubers. And some people don't feel comfortable in shared rides, but rideshare is the only option for a lot of those shifts. On weekends, buses take longer, a lot longer. We need more weekend service. So as you saw, our leading part recommendation on the service side is restoring and investing in service levels, how frequently, how often, and where the service is running. This is the most common and longstanding running concerns of transit riders across all modes and geographies, and shows up in all the transit agency surveys they do. So the work and action of you all today is really important and in the month to come. And it's going to affect services today as well as in the future and for the generations that follow Jackie and I. We really hope you do lean in and take the moment to re-envision some of how we're providing these services and what riders can expect. And continue to build a system that's more nimble and responsive to our changing geography, economy, climate, and other things. Thank you.
Sorry, I guess I got to hold down on this thing. Okay. Good morning. I'm Derek Douglas. I'm the president of the Civic Committee in the Commercial Club of Chicago. And for those who don't know, we're an organization of business and civic leaders that are really focused on how those sectors can positively impact the city and the region. And it was an honor to be asked to participate in this process. And I just want to say that this is an issue that from the Civic Committee standpoint, we've been working on for decades. Public transportation is viewed as one of our top priorities. We see it as really the backbone of the regional economy. And so the task at hand for us as part of this process, but also now for you all, the stakes could not be higher in terms of the future of Chicago, the future of the region, and where we want to go. I will say that the process from our perspective was an example of great governance in action. The CMAP team was tremendous. They led us through, in a very thorough way, the research, the evidence, the data, which was helpful for our committee to be able to weigh in and opine and give our perspective on the things that were being considered. And a lot of the ideas that we talked about in our meeting are showing up in the recommendations that are here. We understood our role to be content experts. It's not our report that we were writing, it was a CMAP report. It's you all as the board who will be voting on that report and presenting it to the state. But our role was to provide input, expertise, to indicate where we think there could be pitfalls or issues that the team needed to consider. But it was all, and it was to, as Amy said, first and foremost, help deal with this pending crisis, this cliff that we're all very concerned about. But we also were charged, when the state legislators came to the first meeting, with reimagining the system, to not hold back in the thinking and the ideas, to not just solve a problem and plug a hole, but to figure out how can we use this as an opportunity to create a best-in-class transit system and what that looks like and what that will require. And that was the task that we took, I think all the committees took, and I believe that's the call that was answered by CMAP in the report that was presented to you for consideration. With respect to how to pay for it, I feel like we had maybe one of the toughest tasks because there's no easy answers, there's no easy outs. And we all know that when you're trying to increase revenues and there's no way to solve this issue without revenue increases, it's a very, very challenging task. And we, candidly speaking, we had different points of view within our own committee. Some people were more comfortable with some of the ideas of revenue increases than others. But there were some things that were really critical, I think, from our perspective, to, if we're going to do what's required to raise the revenues, to build the system we want, there were some things that were very important to our committee members that needed to be part of it. One was that the transit system had to have skin in the game. That means thinking about their fares, that means thinking about controlling cost growth and identifying opportunities for expense reductions. And everybody felt that that needed to be a critical piece of the pie. I was pleased to see that in the recommendations put forward, there was a piece dedicated there. The other thing that was critical was reform has to be part of it. If this is about going to the taxpayers to raise revenues to just give us what we currently have, which you heard Amy's comments, people feel it serves a great purpose, but there's opportunities to strengthen it. Reform needs to be part of it, and that includes the service side and the governance side. And the feeling was if you have a strong package of how the transit system is putting skin in the game, reform, and the equity lens, which was also important, that helps make the case for the revenue increases that are going to be required. But without them, the case starts to come undone. I will say that in terms of the ideas that were presented to our group, we knew that there was no silver bullet, and we liked the approach that CMAP was taking, which was to present options. And I think part of this report is, you know, at the end of the day, the state legislature is going to be the ones to make the final call. And the goal of all of us is to put forward credible options that can really move the system forward in a transformative way. And I think that the report does that. It's not that every single sentence in the report has to be loved by everybody. And you all are going to have to take a vote. I don't think it's going to be possible for you to love every single word and every single thing. But if you have to, looking at the big picture of where we're trying to go, that I think is the goal of what we were trying to achieve. And I feel that the CMAP team has done a great job at bringing us forward. I do want to turn it over, though, to my partner in crime, Dan Cronin, who I think is here and was a very valuable partner and brought his real world perspective to our deliberations. Dan?
Thanks, Derek. Appreciate your remarks, and I agree. It was a gratifying experience because of all the people that were so committed, and the passion and the thorough analysis and the different viewpoints that were taken into consideration. You know, I can say this, and some of this is probably rather obvious, but I think it's important to kind of frame where we are at this point in time. These are indeed very, very tough times. And we have monumental challenges in the city and the region, economically in terms of jobs and business growth, governmentally in terms of taxes and whether or not government is responsive, or whether or not government can solve problems. Do people believe that government can solve problems anymore? And monumental challenges in terms of our communities, our neighborhoods, schools, and whether or not the neighborhoods are safe. On top of all of that, the world changed dramatically with the pandemic, right? And made all of those issues, all of those touch points, even much more of a concern. So the result is there's a tremendous amount of uncertainty, tremendous amount. But one thing I think is so true and accepted as truth by everyone that was involved in this effort, this plan of action for regional transit. All of us that deeply care about Chicago and the region, we want an effective, efficient, clean, attractive, easy to access for all regional public transit system. There's no question about it. And I believe, and I think all of us involved in this process really firmly know that that type of public transit system is essential. It's essential community infrastructure. It has to be there in order for our community to reach the goals and the objectives and to grow and to improve. And that's our responsibility. And in order to get to that, to achieve that objective, what do we do? What do we do as citizens? What do we do as community leaders and people who are active and want to see change? We get together, we talk, we collaborate. We take in different important perspectives and we come up with a report. We come up with a set of recommendations, and that's what you're looking at here today. Derek said it well. There's not, everything in there. I can't say that I am enthusiastically supportive of, but I think it represents a very worthwhile viewpoint, and it needs to be taken into consideration. And our job is to present these different pieces of information, recommendations, and leave it up to the legislature, leave it up to those who will weigh them, and they will do their own analysis. And at the end of the day, they will finally decide what to implement, what to change, and what not to implement. None of the funding solutions are easy, but I do believe this scale of funding is necessary to achieve the system we want, and what our region really, I think, will embrace and and what our region deserves. It's key that we looked at equity implications. We know that there are concerns about who's paying for this system and how the new revenues are going to be married with the old system and how we disperse it and how it's fair and balanced. I think that's critically important, and a lot of those concerns are reflected in the report. Time was that there were regional differences, and there still are. People want to make sure that if I'm out in the suburbs and I'm driving on the tollway, and that I am not being taken advantage of, that everybody's playing their part, and so I think Derek said it. There is no silver bullet. That's a common phrase. It's no answer here is easy. But this is a set of recommendations, a set of considerations that I think needs to be seriously considered, and we need to embrace in order to get to the system we want. I also want to emphasize the cost savings, the fare increases, along with the low-income fare program, are all part of the solution. So, in closing, I just want to say I enjoyed it. How do you define enjoy? I thought it was very gratifying. It was a meaningful exercise of our time and our passion. I've lived in this area and was born in Chicago. I mean, this is where I live, and this is where we all live, and we deeply care about it. My business is here in the city, and all of us know how important Chicago is to the region and how the region is important to Chicago. And so this is a defining moment, and I'm really pleased to be part of it. And I turn it back over to the folks at CMAP and my co-chair, all of whom did a marvelous job, a very thorough job in analyzing and presenting this report for the consideration of the legislature. So thank you very much, and I'll be around. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Great. Well, thank you very much. My name is Robert Puentes. I'm the president and CEO of the Eno Center for Transportation. We're an independent nonprofit based in Washington, D.C. We were brought on to provide some of the technical expertise for the governance element of all of this. It's been a tremendous process. The CMAP team, I echo all those comments, did a tremendous job pulling together this report. We work all across the country, all across the world, and this is a really tremendous piece of work. So kudos to the whole team, the working group, the advisory committees. In addition to the report that you've seen, online, you'll see a bunch of tech memos from Eno where we dig in deeper into some of these governance questions, some of the models that we've seen around the world, around the country, and detailed reflections from interviews that we've had with folks all across the region, folks all across in the room here today. So it's a lot deeper dive on all of those things can be found online. And I echo what Derek said. Operations is tough, and I agree that funding is tougher, and maybe governance is the toughest, right? So we come into this with no illusions that these are easy conversations. As we've heard, these are really, really difficult things to wrestle with. But at the end of the day, we probably do get the best bang for the buck with some of these big changes. So I'll talk about that in just a minute. This, as I said, it is a prominent discussion in many cities and metropolitan areas across the world. So this really does matter, but it's especially true here in the United States, given the fiscal cliffs that a lot of agencies are experiencing, given the challenges related to COVID and the federal emergency money that's winding down, right? So that part is not unique to this region. It's something that's happening all over the place. But I am optimistic and very encouraged when I go around the country and we talk to folks and we see the things that they're trying to do to wrestle with those challenges. There's an awful lot of innovation, experimentation, problem solving, best practices, lessons learned. All these things are happening all around the country, and it's actually really exciting. It's a tremendous challenge, as Dan Cronin said, but there's an awful lot of good things that are happening. So, in that way, failure to act in this region would make the Northeast Illinois an outlier in that way. So we really do think it's very important for lots of different reasons. But when we do work across the country, the governance challenges, it's true. Wrestling with this is happening everywhere. Whether it's older places with established transit like Baltimore, or places that are making massive new investments like Austin, or places that are just trying to get out of the starting gate like Tampa, they're all focusing on these issues of transit governance. So it's not something that is only being discussed here. It is really happening across the country. But all, maybe for different reasons, but all from the same basic core, that transit is regional in nature, and that for the user perspective, right? A lot of this is coming from the user's perspective, an integrated transit governance is really what's needed to have a highly functioning system. So that's kind of how we start about this with, from all over the place. So this is not a new conversation, obviously, here in Chicago. We've talked a little bit about this already today. It's been a discussion that's been going on for a number of years, going back at least, even further back than the Northeast Illinois Public Transit Task Force, which recommended fundamental reforms to the region's transit governance. There have been other recommendations very similar in the years after that, including some by the Eno Center for Transportation back in 2016, 2013, 2014, something like that. But again, similar conversations that have been happening. So this isn't a new set of recommendations, but as we all know, a lot of that hasn't happened. So over the last year, as I said, Eno's been conducting interviews with regional stakeholders. We've been looking around the world for helpful models and examples. We've been poring over what would make sense for this region, because the one thing you find out pretty quickly is that there is not one model for every region. Every region is very different. But there are good examples, there's cool lessons, and there are things that can be applied all over the place. So at this point, I think it's not about whether this is the correct path, what was presented here today. As been said, there's been a lot of deliberation over the last few months, but it's about whether there is the commitment now to really making this happen. And it's not an academic exercise for us. We really agree with what Amy said. The consolidation or coordinate, all this just for consolidation's sake doesn't make any sense. We're all about impact at the Eno Center for Transportation, and just doing something because it's rearranging the deck chairs doesn't make any sense. But we do agree that the region does not have a truly integrated transit system for the reasons that were mentioned. Customer information, service and fares, capital projects, and new routes are not really well integrated or designed with the regional perspective, and the RTA does not really have the ability to take full advantage of its powers to prioritize those regional needs, to conduct extensive audits, and to do alternative analysis for major projects. So it really does matter, the things that we're talking about here today. But I'll just wrap up saying that we do agree that governance alone is not going to solve these problems. It requires a bigger look, and funding alone is not going to fix all the problems. Operational fixes alone aren't going to solve all the problems, but it is this unified package that was presented before you here today that actually really will make a big difference. And given the work that we've done around the world and around the country, we think it has a tremendous opportunity for impact. Thank you very much.
Is it still morning? Good morning. This is a little odd for me. I'm used to sitting somewhere over there. But thank you for inviting me. I'm Randy Blankenhorn. I had the pleasure, along with Carol Brown, the former president of the CTA, as serving as the co-chairs of this group about how we implement it. And while we want to talk about governance, there is more than governance in this group. And we want to make sure that some of those things, like how we distribute funds, don't get lost as we just think about whether or not we're going to rearrange the deck chairs. Let me be perfectly clear that the service board structure, the RTA structure, the people are doing what it is entirely designed to do. The CTA does what it's designed to do. The PACE does what they're designed to do. Metro does. And it is designed that way because that's how we thought things needed to work 40 years ago. We don't make decisions based on what is good, really. We make decisions on what's best for our own individual service, and that's purposeful. Decide if that's the system that we want. Do we want a system that's regional in nature, that works when it can, but makes decisions based on its own best interests? I think that's what we struggled with. And let me be perfectly clear that the second option doesn't give you that regional perspective, that total regional perspective. You still have service boards, you still have the boards that are there that are making decisions based on their best interest. And so we need to talk about this. We've talked about it for almost 25 years now. And do we have the will to think about things differently? When you look at the responsibilities that Amy had on, to me, that's a sliding scale. What goes under a regional agency? What goes under an operating agency? How you govern it? You can talk about it in a whole different sliding way. And I think we need to think about what decisions are truly regional and what decisions are left best to the people that are operating on a day-to-day basis. I'll use my IDOT experience. We made general policy decisions at the central office, but each district made day-to-day decisions on how to deal with the roads, how to deal with access, how to deal with bridges under the general policies of a central authority. And that seemed to work. I don't think any of you had any problems finding out who to talk to at IDOT when you had an issue. And so we need to think about the scale of what happens at the service board or the service provider level and what happens at the regional level. I think the question is for us is how do we make the best decisions? How do we give the riders the service they need, the experience they need, the access that they need in a way that makes sense to them? Outside of this room, nobody cares if they're on a PACE bus or a CTA bus or a Metro train. That's not what they care about. They care about whether they can get from point A to point B efficiently and in a cost-effective manner. That's in a safe manner. That's what they care about. And how do we set up a system that does that? That's how we got to here today. That's what you're going to struggle with a little over the next month as you look at this report. It's certainly something that the General Assembly is going to deal with. But I think it's important for this region to decide one question, and that is, do we want a regional transit system or do we want 3 operating agencies? And I think if you decide that here with the people in this room, that goes a long way in how the General Assembly is going to react to it. I do want to talk really briefly about the things that actually matter a little more to me, and that is how we distribute funds. We distribute funds based on a formula that's 40 years old. Frank Beal and I have talked about this for 10 years, that no business stays alive allocating funds the same way they did 40 years ago. It just doesn't make sense. And part of that is the recovery ratio system. I actually believe that recovery ratio in some manner makes some sense. But right now, it's the major driver in investment decisions. And that's not what should happen. We should have performance goals, we should have performance measurement. We should be able to make decisions that make sense for where we're trying to go as a region and how we're trying to provide public transit. Now, the truth is life has changed, and it's going to continue to change. And we need a regional transit system that can react to it, that can deal with the changes as they occur, that can bring people back to work the way we need them to, that can move people in ways that we didn't imagine 5 years ago pre-pandemic. But as Dorval and I talked about many years ago, this is not a pandemic issue. This whole thing has been coming on us, and we've reached a point. And it's really up to you all making these decisions in this room about how we're going to deal with it. I want to also thank Aaron and the CMAP staff. They did a terrific job with especially in my group, a lot of different voices that had a lot of different opinions, but pulling it together in a report that makes sense. Thanks to Erin and her group for doing such a wonderful job. Thank you.
I'd like to thank the steering committee, and we've got both the staff here, myself and the steering committee, that can answer your questions
Let's open up the floodgates. I think just given that we have both committees here, if the chairman don't mind, I will go ahead and facilitate questions, responses.
I'm not getting into any additional comments been made. I made mine in the beginning. I'm just going to open it up to some questions that we may have to the members. Go ahead.
You do have to hold it.
Okay, I got it now. I want to also be one to commend and congratulate the CMAP staff for putting this together. They really have done a very intricate job in a very complex conversation. The one thing that I just want to throw on the table here, and I've talked to Aaron about this, when you had the roll call today, you named Kendall County as one of them that was supposed to be here. Well, you may have them here, but they're not a member of the RTA and they're not paying the tax. So I think that's an interesting dilemma for us to have if we've got somebody in the game here and we talk about the need for revenue. Kendall County needs to be at the table throwing their money on the table. I just think that. It just doesn't make any sense. It's an old-time political thing that I think way dates probably everybody that's sitting here, but it's been around for a while, and they're my next-door neighbor, so I get it in my face all the time about how they're not coming into the RTA and pay the tax, but they want the train. So it's an interesting dilemma to have, but it's a pretty powerful problem that we are facing. I just think that we're on the right track here, no pun intended, but we really do need to do some modernization of the system, and we need to put things in a better order. And I think there's a way to do it, and I have full faith with the group that's been put together and the presentation that was given here today that we will do this. And I really would encourage us all on to do it. I think probably the next time we meet, there'll be quite a bit of argument about who's appointing who to run this thing and who's going to be on the board to make the calls. And that ought to be one heck of a conversation. So I thank you all for everything you're doing, and let us all go forth and continue to work together to find a solution. I was on the Lipinski committee, which was when we defrauded the CATS and NIPSI groups way back when. And that was not a short conversation either. And I think, Jerry Bennett, you were on it with me. And that one went on for quite a while. And I think at the end of the day, the thing came together and we got CMAP out of it. And that's been a real blessing for the Chicago area ever since. So I appreciate all the good effort that's been made. Just know that this isn't easy and it's not going to come real quick, because as we learned in the Lipinski Commission, it takes time. So thank you.
Thanks, Mayor. Just, again, I could probably comment on anything that's been said here, but this shouldn't really get down to the final issue of governance, that the work that's gone into this, about the financial clip that we're in, the direction we need to go to the future. I think we're all adults, been in public office, and it's not an ego thing. If as was changed 23 years ago in the formation of NIPSI and CATS, that we went forward with something that was going to be good for the region. So just a quick comment about it should not be that. It should not really be over an ego. Other questions?
Diane, and then County Executive Bertino Tarrant.
Like everybody else who's spoken, I have to acknowledge all the work that has gone into this. And we talk about the CMAP staff, which is always phenomenal, and certainly have demonstrated that here. But I think all of the steering committee work and all of the other people that have been touched in this process have made it a really, really good document for us to consider, and a real way to describe the issues and the challenges that we're facing today. I just want to make sure we don't forget where we started this conversation. When Erin first opened this up, she said that this was about the people. Daniel said it, Jackie and Amy have talked about it. And as we think about the people, I think it's important to think about those people who are in the South suburban area, just as well as we think about the people that are in the city. The challenges are probably a bit even more significant in the South suburban area. If I think about over time how PACE and Metro have disconnected, in the sense that buses that used to take people to Metro are not doing that anymore. If I think about the schedules of the trains and the kinds of things that are going on in the South suburbs, there are lots of challenges there. And those challenges are for the individuals who live there, but they're really about even the, if you will, improvement of lifestyle and quality of life for those individuals. I recently had a conversation with a not-for-profit group that is putting a concept together that would sort of identify a model community in the south suburbs that sort of bases all of the improvement in quality of life by starting with healthy foods that make people able to go to work, that give people all the other kinds of adjacent, if you will, desires and needs if they're healthy. And one of the things that they said was, one of the problems we have, though, is, of course, is that we have a huge issue with transportation. If we make people healthy, if we provide them with the things that they need in order to go to work, and we find those jobs for them to go to, we don't really have a way to get them there. And so when we think about the people in the south suburbs, there are individual issues, whether we talk about how long it takes PACE to be able to take people, drop people off and pick them up and the rest of that, or whether we talk about the things that can happen in the south suburban community that would improve that area and hopefully create models that can go in other parts of our region. It's really important that we think about those people that are in those communities and that we think about how we can help them.
Thanks, Diane. Executive Bertino Tarrant and Matt Walsh.
And thank you, and I will echo everyone, and thank you for your hard work on this. I know it's been a long process, and I do appreciate the time. Aaron, I appreciate the phone call as well. And, you know, I think we can each as local officials kind of comment on certain aspects of it. But really, and I have probably beat this to a dead horse with my friends at CMAP, the biggest concern I have is the expectation for most of this funding to be dependent on a political decision. And that's going to be to possibly increase a service tax, which, if you had to ask my opinion, if that was done, my first focus would be on to help our education system. We cannot dismiss the fact that there may be people who want it in the legislation, and there may be people who will advocate for it. But if this is our sole focus, is that we are going to really hope that we are going to go to Springfield and ask these members to vote on a increased tax, it's going to be nearly impossible. I shouldn't use the word impossible, but it's going to be extremely, extremely difficult, because they may agree that it is needed, but to press that button, yes, is going to be hard. I do think, you know, and I have said this before, and I don't know if this was discussed in any of this steering committee, and there's the American Public Transportation that has addressed the success of referendums. Was that ever a discussion? I'm going to say this tongue in cheek, but let's hire Local 150 and let's get a referendum out there to pass some funding so we can get this done right. I don't know who it would be addressed to. Was anything in
The
regards
team
to?
can talk a little bit about whether or not we'd looked at a referendum.
Yeah, I don't think that we had moved yet into the space of how and when each of the elements would be passed. So it is something that we can continue to talk about with the state legislators and our intergovernmental affairs group here as well.
Matt.
Thank you. Matt Walsh, I represent Western Cook County. You know, Amy, a few moments ago, you mentioned about one of the primary goals is to have a desirable transit system for current and future users. And I've heard a lot about reliability and efficiency and ease, but I haven't heard a lot about safety. And I think one of the bigger concerns of people I've heard, and it could be anecdotal, I mean, I don't know if it's actual true, is there's a perception, whether real or not, that it is not safe to ride public transportation. And I haven't heard much about that. And it is part of governance or funding. I think safety needs to be really front and center to reassure our citizens that it's safe to ride public transportation.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I do think there are recommendations that we do talk about safety improvements, whether that's you know, communication, transit ambassadors, things like that. So there are sections of the report that do address that. That was something that was called out within the legislation and something that we took very seriously of hearing from this board and hearing from riders, that was critical. So we can talk in more specifics about what they are, but we do address recommendations in order to improve safety. And again, that's part of that ensuring public confidence in the system.
Leanne.
Thank you. Let's see if I can do two things at once, hold the button down and speak, because that could be complicated for me.
But I want to start by actually thanking the steering committee, appreciate even the comments that you've added here today, and the CMAP staff for all the work that you've done in getting us to this point. Obviously, I wear a transit hat in this conversation. And it's been, I know, a lot of hard work and a lot of hours and a lot of dialogue just to even get us to this point. And I think, when I think about public transportation, I think it is fundamentally a hallmark of a civilized society. And I think we're all agreeing that that is a really critical, important for our regions. There's also talk about sort of world-class region. And I think the fact too that a lot of the conversation to this point has had a very much a rider-centric lens put on it. I think that that is really critical because that is ultimately, we're a means to an end. Public transport is not the end, it is a means to the end. And that's really helping us, I think, in creating a vibrant economic region. I think it helps us in our ongoing fight against climate change and climate issues. And I think it really helps us in this broader and maybe even tougher conversation around equity and mobility and how are we serving this region and the people of this region. So I want to thank everyone for that work that has happened already to date. I also want to thank the staff specifically because I know we have had countless hours of additional conversations. And I think that this latest draft reflects much of the feedback that we from at least the RTA perspective, have shared with you to make sure that the report is very clearly and sort of acknowledging the full extent of the funding gap that we are facing. Because as I think many of us have said, if we don't solve that funding gap, what we want and how we want to distribute it and how we want to govern it is almost a moot conversation because there is no transit system to be talking about. So we have to keep the very real and rather imminent funding shortfall front and center in this conversation. So addressing that $730 million gap, which is sort of the starting number, is absolutely critical. And really, I think the acknowledgement of these kind of baseline funding elements that incorporate the fully funding of ADA paratransit, fully funding the reduced and free ride programs, essentially services that the service boards are all charged with delivering on an annual basis, which really is a big chunk, as you saw off some of the numbers, the biggest chunk or one of the biggest chunks of our funding gap that we face. And I think that that's really important in sort of recognizing all of that. I just wanted to add a couple of quick points, and sorry if I'm sort of taking a chunk of time, but I think it's important that transit speak to some of these things. I still think that the report, while I think does a lot to speak to the operating shortfalls, and I know it's been raised before, but the recognition that we acknowledge the existing already operating, capital state of good repair funding gap that still exists. The region as a whole has a $5.3 billion gap over the next 10 years. And if we want to even begin to talk about not just the system that we sort of have and supporting that, but as importantly, funding the system that we want, we are going to need more and a stable, reliable capital funding source. While we're incredibly grateful to the legislature for Rebuild Illinois, our federal government for the IIJA, those kinds of funding sources that are really helping bolster the capital side of things, we can't forget that that stable funding need on the capital side is absolutely a parallel part of this conversation. And then another point that I just want to make is that I think it's important that we think about how we think about not eliminating, there's a menu of revenue options on the table here. And I think it's important, at least at this point in the conversation, that we not take things off the table or not pick winners and losers at this point. I think many of us have been around through many iterations of these kinds of conversations, and we recognize that there's a lot of politics and a lot of other issues that have to play into those conversations. And so keeping that full complement of options and opportunities, I think, is really important for, I would suggest that we consider going forward. On the governance side, I will express that the RTA is very eager to continue to work with all of you and engage in this conversation as we go forward. I think it is important that we be part of the conversation as we're talking about not just efficiencies, but ways to strengthen the service delivery, the fair policy, the capital investments, and all the myriad of other issues, some of which have been touched on today.
And I think it's really important, as we're talking about all of those things too, that equity is a strong, important lens as we are thinking through all of those factors, as well as the governance piece as we move forward. I think that the conversations really need to happen in the context of understanding the revenue and the resources that we have available and what opportunities might be there in the future. And it's important that we can't let a lot of noise distract us from the conversation, this very real fiscal cliff that we are facing in the coming few years. But in the context of that, I would suggest that we also challenge ourselves and to sort of challenge the existing structure, even that we have in this present time, to deliver on many of those goals and outcomes that we are looking for as we continue the broader governance conversation. And with that, I'll just conclude with the RTA. I think many of you have heard, we have a strategic plan that we put together in advance of this work that was actually informed by many of you sitting around this table, as well as very extensive and broad community outreach across the entire region. And we will continue, you have our commitment that we are continuing to pursue both the action and advocacy items within that plan, and I think start to become the foundation from which we can build to show the region, the riders, and our legislative leaders that we can deliver on a lot of these things that everybody is talking about, these outcomes that we're striving for. And that includes things like the integrated fares, improving safety and security, incentivizing TOD and equitable TOD across our region, transit-oriented development. I feel like we're in a safe space to use that acronym. And we just want to, we stand ready to continue those conversations. So I look forward to hearing the rest of the conversation today and partaking in future discussions. So thanks.
Thank you. Mayor Roding?
Thanks, Erin. I'm Nancy Rotary, Mayor of Highland Park, and I represent Lake County on the CMAP board. And just want to continue the thanks to the steering committee as well as to the CMAP staff and everyone who's been working on this. Thank you all for your bold thinking. I've been involved in many discussions with COGS and the Metropolitan Mayor's Caucus, and I'm looking forward to continued dialogue with our state reps and our state senators. I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts from my reading of the report, and good to see you, Jackie Grimshaw. It's lovely to hear from you. You spoke about jobs in the city and the abilities to get to that job from Rolling Meadows, and I'll add, or from Round Lake, or from Waukegan, or from Kenosha. And I appreciated Amy's comments. I know folks who have to take the bus to get to the train, to get to their job in the city, and I appreciated what the report highlighted about people spending almost as time getting to work as being at work. From my part of Lake County, to get to the College of Lake County, it takes over 2 hours on public transit each way, and that limits the ability of those who want to increase their education. So my overarching concern in this conversation is those who are frozen in their lives due to lack of transit and the acuity of transit deserts in the collar counties. Regarding the representation on the boards and other decisions, I hope that that will be taken into account. I understand that linear addressing of population to representation, population to funding, but I also posit the reverse, which is because of these deserts, we now don't have population. Let me see what else. As the report notes, the brunt of these effects would be felt by the groups least able to afford it. I also appreciated the raising of the issue of business and resident needs for hyper-local last mile transit in the collar counties. So many businesses in my part of Lake County were relying on shuttle bugs from the Metro, which are now gone. And so now I wonder, how are folks getting to work? They're either driving or they're working remotely or they're no longer working there. I appreciate the recognition of the chicken and egg fare issues. For us, again, our fare box revenue dropped, and with that, we lost routes. So that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy again. We can't even have people on those routes because they no longer exist. One question I had was whether there was accounting for future housing trends. We at CMAP just approved that DePaul study. Wanted to know whether that's being taken into account. And how will those trends be accounted for? I have a concern, and I understand we just heard from Leanne about all funding should stay on the table. I do have a concern about cannibalizing MFT. I know for many of us, MFT dollars are already critical for our local infrastructure investment as well as our maintenance. And one question I did have, I don't know if I read this correctly in the report, was that there was a possibility of increasing the number of roads on which tolls would be sought. Is that something that we had talked about? And if that is the case, then again, I have a concern about penalizing those who have to live further from their employment due to cost, now paying more, and then not receiving increased transit in return. Love the integrated fares, appreciate all the good financial stewardship. I had a question about when we anticipate the further study on road use charges versus motor fuel taxes. I am a lover of efficiency, and I love the efficiencies that come with consolidated management, but I just share the voices that say we need to protect representation of the collar counties. One last question I had, and maybe those who are more in transit know the answer, but given the fiscal challenges of so many of our country's major city transit systems, have we talked to the federal government? Are there potential federal dollar opportunities? And with that, I just say again, thank you.
Let me see if I can cover a couple of those here quickly. Is that, the tolling of the entire system here has been contemplated and is as part of our regionally reasonably expected revenues for the 2050 plan, but that our policy position as an agency would be that tolls would support parallel transit use, right? That we're thinking about the system holistically. That again is quite a ways out. And not happening tomorrow, so it's not going to be able to fulfill our gap and need in the next couple of years. MFT, we've heard also from our stakeholders across the region that we don't want to diminish existing MFT sources, so we are talking about on top of, but recognizing that different parts of our region are in competition with their border states that border us, and those rates do really matter in some places, that we do note that that's important, but want to make sure that that's part of the considerations. And then let me just touch on the federal government side of things. We will always continue to talk about operating assistance from the federal government. We think it's important. I think with a split Congress, we will be hard pressed to see that come to fruition anytime soon here. But I'm sure my transit partners could maybe articulate a little bit more on that if I'm wrong. I noted that Carolyn had her hand up online, and I noted Member Beal would like to also speak. I've got Reinbold, Darch, and Commissioner. Superintendent. Carolyn?
Thank you. I just wanted to follow up on a couple things. I appreciate the comments of Mayor Rotering and as well as Leanne, and in particular, when Leanne mentioned the funding and the stable funding source, I just wanted to reiterate the concern and how we need to be focusing on that funding and the funding source prior to really getting into that governance piece. And questions on with those. There were a lot of funding options that were put out there, but really no follow-up on it. So I was curious as to, once we turn this over to the General Assembly, are those going to remain kind of just as general funding recommendations rather than taking a full analysis and seeing how they would be implemented and executed, and how the impact would actually be on those funding sources? And then the second piece of that would be on the governance as well. Randy had mentioned in his comments, which I do appreciate, the steering committee weighing in, is he did say that CMAP and the MPO should decide on that governance to put our preference forward so that it would carry more weight. And I feel, I agree with him on that point as well as on the funding. And is there going to be the opportunity to do that, to have sort of the board's preference that moves forward to the General Assembly on either the governance piece or on the funding piece? And if so, I think there's a lot more questions and information that need to be received prior to doing that. Or are we going to just turn it over to the General Assembly and then they're going to decide for themselves? I would like the conversation to continue, and I really would prefer that our resources be used in order to answer those questions rather than have it filled in by the legislators.
Agreed, Carolyn. I think our goal is to deliver this, but recognize that there's a strong role for CMAP and the board to continue to play advisory role on some of these details. We recognize that we haven't been able to get into all of the details of all of the analysis of all of the things in 9 months' time, but that we would continue to serve as expert advisors on sort of what the increment of revenues might be able to be achieved, or a little bit more detail on working with our transit partners, or that there could be some additional asks as we work on this work. As for governance, I think one of the things that we would like to offer our board members and our MPO members and other partners is that if you have additional feedback, we'd like to receive it by December. I don't know why I said September 22nd. I do think, to the extent that we can coalesce around a unified vision here, I think it will be helpful to our position as a region as we work with our General Assembly members. That being said, I know that this is tough, and so we want to continue. This is part of the collection of feedback that we need to take into consideration before we move into October. All right.
Hey, Aaron,
Can I just make two more comments on that?
Go right ahead.
I'm sorry. So one, if maybe you can point that out more in the reports or solidify that the conversation should continue and more information should be received prior to any legislative changes or any implementation. I don't know. I mean, it's 126 pages. I read it, but I don't know if it's in there somewhere that I missed.
That's fair.
And then the second piece is the other concern I had too is where it was on reflecting the population on the governance portion. And I don't want to get into too much detail with that because I think that will play out differently. But I am concerned with, and Mayor Rodering alluded to it, that the reflection of population ridership and funding. I think the one key part to really highlight there is, we've been talking about over the last 40 years, things have really changed. And that is one thing that has really changed, is the way people commute and the way that the collar counties have expanded. And I feel like that basing it on really population may not be representative of really that ridership, and the funding may not be representative of that as well, as far as that utilization back and forth between those collar counties and the city. So that piece is, in particular, I would really hope there would be a lot more research and elaborate on the potential use, not only current use, but the potential use of that as well, so that it does reach out into the suburbs and the collar counties to be representative of and allow for us to be really involved and benefit from the evolution of transit.
Just quickly in response to Carolyn and what I said about the MPO Policy Committee and the board ought to weigh in on these, I've always been of the belief that the region ought to decide how to govern itself and not have the General Assembly tell them how to do it. And so that's why I brought that up. I think it's a discussion that you need to have. I don't think it's a discussion you're going to solve in the next 4 weeks. But I think it's an ongoing discussion that it carries weight if you decide how you think you want to be governed when you go to Springfield.
I appreciate that, Randy. Thanks so much. That's all I had. Thanks.
I've got Frank Beal, Reinbold, Darch, Sis, and Chair Kwasniewski.
I had a question for Randy. I'm not sure I heard you correctly. Did you say that a real regional governance program is not option 2, but it's option 1?
Yes, I did say that. I don't believe, and I think that our working group, if you keep the 3 boards, the CTA, the Metro, the PACE board, you will continue to make decisions based on what's in their best interest and not in a regional best interest.
I see. Well, we're going to be asked to vote on this in 4 weeks, I guess it is. And I could enthusiastically vote yes on the entire project with one exception, and it has to do with this. What troubles me about the governance is that the sense of equivalency between 1 and 2, achieving the goals of the plan. I think it's possible for 2 to do that, but I do not think that it's articulated well at all in the report. And if the report were changed to articulate that more effectively, then I think it would be easier for me to vote yes on it.
I think, Frank, that you're right, that under either option, you can get the results you want. You can have a great system with bad governance and a bad system with good governance. It doesn't define itself. So I don't think our group believes that either, and why it's there is we don't believe that it can't be accomplished under either way. I think it's just the approach that you're going to take to regionalism versus individual silos.
The confusion, if you read the report, Two is referred to sometimes as strengthening the RTA. Other times it's referred to as envisioning the RTA, re-envisioning the RTA. And then the chart that's offered simply says regional entity. It doesn't even mention the RTA. And then I noticed this morning, the executive summary combines two of those, and it's referred to as strengthen a region-visioned RTA. So it seems to me to reflect a kind of a dancing around the issue here. And governance is not implementation. This is how do we implement it. Governance is a really important part of implementation, but it's not the whole of implementation. And I think we've shortchanged ourselves by not directing that more. Just a couple of examples, one of which has to do with the governance structure of the service boards. I don't think the report says that the service boards the governance ought to be redone, but I think it was referred to in the presentation. Is that right? That it's an important consideration.
Yes, correct. We are asking, even under option 2, a reconsideration of board composition.
But that's not clear in the report.
That's a good note.
Yeah,
We'll take
not
note of
clear
that.
at all in the report. And just to the issue of implementation, and you can't get in, given the nature of the time and the resources available, you can't get into excruciating detail here. But you know, the system we want has a new design for a regional bus system, a robust, enhanced bus system. Well, the CTA is limited in its coverage to the city and the northern suburbs and the western suburbs. That needs to be changed. You need to rewrite that in order to provide the resources of the CTA on a regional scale. And there's dozens and dozens of places within the existing enabling legislation for all 4 agencies that needs to be reviewed, analyzed, changed, updated, and all that can help number 2. It's obvious in number 1 because you scrap it all and you start over. So number 1 is obvious. You're going to have a regional system and you're starting from scratch. But if you don't want to start from scratch, you could make a pretty effective option 2, but it isn't very clear in the report.
Thanks for that feedback, Frank. Mayor Reinbold?
Thank you. Understanding that it's the legislature that has tasked us with this responsibility, have we had any discussions with leadership that some action will be taken? And I ask that question because it wouldn't be the first time an organization has made a recommendation to Springfield and no action was taken. So my question is, will the legislature or will leadership support the recommendation, either verbatim or a components thereof? And if we have not had that conversation with leadership, we might want to consider that. Thank you.
Thank you. We have been keeping leadership apprised of the report progress as it's gone along. So, I think they recognize that this is just as tough as we do. Thank you. I'll add Dorval to the list here. President Darch.
Yes. All right. It's a task for me to hold on and talk at the same time, but a couple of points I want to make, and I hope I find a question if there's supposed to be a question in this. I think it's important as an underlying feature of the whole report that we understand and believe that transit exists to serve the needs of the people, residents, and businesses, and not the reverse, that we exist to support transit, if you will. And I'll explain a little bit more. The whole regional view here is critical, as you've heard from all of us around the table. Every part of our region relies on the transit system. With the hundreds of people that I rode in on Metra today, as we got off in Ogilvie with the thousands of commuters who then filled these buildings and are so significantly important to the economy of Chicago, and that transit is important to the economy of our communities. In all of this and in the report, the local view there's a lot that's a lot of mention of the region. The region is composed of a major city of Chicago and all of the surrounding area. We make the region. So the voices of suburbia are critical on the boards and in legislation. And I think that our state legislators will respect that. I hope so. So important. The respect for local control, which is kind of fundamental to local government, which many of us represent. I appreciate the staff commentary on the need for transit-oriented development and facilitating that. I was happy that the examples in the report were of the city of Blue Island and the city of Chicago and how they had changed their zoning and review process to facilitate that. I was a little taken aback at the suggestion that perhaps one of the recommendations of the report is that the state should streamline the process for other transit-oriented development approval. Transit-oriented development is going to mean different things, and land use near transit means different things for different communities in the region. That's part of the beauty and diversity of our region. In a community like mine, where we have massive public parking around our transit to accommodate our subregion, folks who live and drive to the metro station to take the train to work, so they're not driving and filling up I-90 and whatever else. The decision about the use of that property is very much something that my community owns, supports, and has made that decision to support transit, regional transit by that. The idea that somehow localities would not be able to control those decisions, I think is a concern. Just a comment on the funding, changing the fare box recovery. I think what is a critical piece of this report and the ongoing sustainability of the transit system is performance, reviewing demand, reviewing ridership, and understanding that that has to work. There has to be proper use of the system, and when it's not being used, then the boards need to make a decision to change that service, which I think is what they've done so far. We all understand, I think, the need to make up for the fiscal cliff, to make up for the funds that we'll lose. But the question of changing the recovery ratio to below 50% is a concern to me, because I don't know, I think that's a significant metric in measuring a system and being able to manage it effectively. So I would have concern with reducing that. I understand things have changed, but accountability is going to require some metric, and that seems to be an important one to me. Finally, on the governance piece, so Randy, I'll weigh in on a thought on one or two. A concern for me on number 2 is if you're doing a merger, essentially, of 3 separate providers who have different debt and pension liability and labor conditions. And the report speaks to this point, and Amy, you've done a good job of referencing it, but it is a major concern, I think, in going with option 2, where you keep the separate entities so that those are clearly highlighted for the legislature to see and for all of us to see is important. I do think that most people in the region expect that the RTA or the oversight board does have and should have more authority in terms of fare structure and making the ease of using the system better. So I think that makes a heck of a lot of sense, but I think there are positives about keeping the separate service boards at this point in terms of transparency and accountability. So thank you.
I was just going to make here at no time will this board, when CMAP was formed, the question about whether or not CMAP would have some authority over local zoning, that'll never take place. We have always honored the tradition of local control. through zoning processes, and that will continue. This report does not recommend that. In the area of planning or funding for planning is different than you having control over your local streets and your various property within the village. That'll never change. That'll never change.
We've got if you don't mind, we've got a few board members that I need to get to. Thank you. Superintendent Killen, I've got Chair Kwasniewski, Nina, and then President Dorval Carter.
Erin, thank you. And I just really want to commend the work of CMAP and the steering committee. You know, defining the system that we want is something that really is of critical importance. And I think that the considerations that we had and the needs that we had were really well addressed. Some of my questions here for the steering committee have been answered, but I do have a few more, and I'd like to offer a few comments, or would you like to get through all the questions first? Okay, thank you. As we're talking about regional board appointments, you know, in the document, you know, and on the screen today, that it was, is that just applied to the regional entity, or is that for all boards? I did hear, Amy, you did clarify that in the presentation under option 2, you know, that you are looking for some changes there. How does that now apply with the presentation that was given today?
Yeah, it's consistent, and we hear that didn't come clear through the report, and so that will be an update that we'll make. But those baseline reform principles, we believe, need to be applied to either option.
Okay, I really appreciate that. And in this discussion, again, really happy we're having it. You know, transit is critically important to Cook County, and CMAP, you've done a really good job. This is about service for the people. This is about access to jobs. This is about quality of living and how we can create a thriving and economically competitive region. We've heard it said that our transit system is the envy of many cities across the nation, and the time that we have here to be bold and be transformational is something that I think we all need to take to heart. And it sounds like the legislature is really ready to take on whatever recommendations are going to be coming from this committee. From Cook's perspective, we are extremely pleased to see that fair integration is in the report. It was in RTA's report. We see it carried through here. We're very happy to see that we have expansion of fare subsidies for youth and all riders with low income. Really pursuing income-based fares is something that we need to look at. And as we're looking at the funding packages, we need to make sure we're looking at that yes and. This is a once in a generational ask that we're going to have with the legislature, and the decisions made are something that we're going to have to live for quite some time. We've seen this play out already, and while we always say we don't want history to repeat itself, I think we need to be cautious about what paths we may intentionally or unintentionally take ourselves down if we are not being bold in this initiative. So we want to ensure that we're meeting the needs of our residents. We want to support that access to a robust workforce for our businesses, but we recognize we need to pay for it. I think we have heard we are up for the challenge and do support those alternatives that are very bold and very transformational, looking at it in both terms of investment and looking at leadership from a regional entity to make sure that we have that cohesiveness, we have that synchronization, and that forward vision toward achieving our regional goals. We want to make sure that we're creating a system that has flexibility to respond to, emerging market conditions and to be innovative. And if we put ourselves, in silos too far into silos, we might inhibit that ability. So that's something we need to make sure we keep strong consideration of across this committee, the board, and for the future activities of the legislature.
Kwasniewski.
Thank you. I just want to say, first of all, obviously, thank you to CMAP and the steering committee for putting this together in light speed. And I think that's something to consider as well. Obviously, I think we all wish we would had more time to be able to develop this and really go through it. I mean, the white papers are just being completed, which, as everyone knows, the devil's always in the details in regards to what the study means and so forth. You've heard a lot of questions here today. One of the things I want to highlight is, we've heard a little bit about agencies not working together. And I think perhaps maybe at the next meeting, maybe there could be an opportunity for the transit agencies to highlight a lot of the projects that we have been working together on, quite frankly, that I don't believe people in this room really know. I mean, we've got projects throughout the region that we work with CTA on, with Metra on, that we're partners in. And even with IDOT and so forth. So I think those things really need to be highlighted so everyone understands that, you know, we're not a bunch of siloed agencies that are not working together. So I think that I think needs to be clarified a little bit, and perhaps an opportunity to kind of lay out some of those things. The other thing is, obviously, you've identified that, you know, the agencies are efficient, at least from the standpoint of with our peers. And I think some of the things that we always try to do, and I know at PACE, Cook County is different than Lake County, than McHenry, than Kane, than Will, than DuPage. And what we really try to do is try to get service that really makes sense for those regions. And I think, you know, taking away a more localized effort from even a board standpoint, irregardless of whether, say, it needs to be mayors or not mayors, I don't think anybody's, you know, got an issue with it. I don't, because quite frankly, I don't think I'm going to be looking for reappointment in 2026. So whatever ends up happening with here, it's not going to affect me. But my concern is having that local knowledge of the region and interaction, I think, is very important. So I think we would like to have that opportunity to be able to do that. In regards to, you know, the governance structure, I'm going to leave that to the elected officials. I think they're going to weigh in more. But, you know, I do agree with Frank Beal. I think, you know, if you're looking at a couple of different structures of whether or not we blow the system up, if I've heard that referred to, or a mega board or whatever the case may be, or look at the existing structure and say, okay, what's wrong with the existing structure? Let's add in those things that everybody thinks are important. You know, the devil's always in the details, but I think all the transit agencies and everyone could probably, you know, work towards that, because the goal is us all working together, which my point is, there's been a picture painted, and I'm not saying in this report, I'm just saying in comments in general that we're not doing that. It's the farthest thing from the truth. And we've got a lot of programs throughout the region, I think, that are really beneficial that, you know, shame on us for maybe not highlighting it more than we have been, but maybe we need to do that so everyone really understands the types of things that we're doing in regards to metro stations and having Van Go there and some of the different programs that we're doing uniquely, working with TNCs, Uber, Lyft, and so forth, to highlight different things that we're trying to make do with the money we've got and enhance the service that we need based upon this new environment where not everybody is going to work. And I don't know about any of the other transit agencies, but we're not going to be running service just to run service. We're going to run service to serve people. And I think that's what we continue to try to do. If something's brought up to us regionally or from the collars or whatever the case may be, that there's an issue, municipalities, we try to work with them and try to figure out, what are we missing? Can we put something back into place? But certainly not to just run buses to and from metro stations or whatever. I mean, we work very closely with Metro. Metro gave us parking spaces in some municipal lots to be able to have these vans there that are basically like rideshare. And so, I mean, we are working uniquely on programs. And I think those things need to be highlighted if you're going to be looking at whether or not we work together. Because I can tell you, you talk to the other agencies and they'll probably say the same thing. So I think the other thing is the challenge for, I think, these boards is really going to be what's in that resolution and how that resolution is worded, because I don't care if it's revenue or if it's governance, I don't believe you're going to get this entire room to agree on any specific thing unless it's more open to, you know, the different caveats that there's a lot of things that have to happen. And so I think the crafting of that resolution is going to have to be very important for even, and I'm not an elected official anymore, but if I were, I'd be very careful about voting on a resolution that's going to say, we think you should consider doing all these increases in taxes. I'm not saying they couldn't. So I think it really needs to cater to that.
We do include a draft resolution in your board packet. I think one of the things that you'll see in there is it really talks about the need and the looming fiscal cliff and the importance of transit to this region, and that it's conveying the report to the General Assembly for their consideration, but not that we're asking for folks to really sign off on every single issue that's in there, and recognizes that you all may need an opportunity to express some of the different unique differences that exist across the region.
I think my only other thing before I leave is just, I had a question for Randy, because, I listened to some of the steering committee meetings and so forth, and I didn't get an impression that there was one preference of governance or the other that came out of that committee, unless I missed something. So is that true or not?
Well, we certainly never took a vote, Rick. I think that I was talking about where the committee was in their comments, and the comments that we've had both in the steering committee and in the regular committee. Carol's not here with me to say one way or another, but Amy, certainly nothing is 100%, right? Nobody agreed with every piece of it. But I think that the steering committee felt that we needed to think about what a regional agency would look like. Again, but we put two options forward. We didn't say, we said it's this continuum of what goes into what activity stays at a regional agency, what stays at an operating agency. The board structure is a different kind of a concept. But so yeah, there was no vote taken. I was just trying to display the kind of the sense of what the committee's issues were.
Thank you. Nina, CTA, NOC, Metra, and then DuPage.
All right, lively conversation. Once again, thank you to the CMAP staff. That could not be understated, and also to the steering committee for your amazing work over the last year, trying to get us, trying to get everybody together for consensus, right? We're not looking for one right answer. We're looking for consensus for a better regional transit system. There's a few things as I've been listening and absorbing the information that I just want to highlight. I understand that change is scary. I understand that taking on a new responsibility, especially something as big as trying to understand how the next 50 years in this region will go, is a very hefty challenge. But I ask my colleagues to look past their fear and be excited about what's possible, and thinking about how we can make a better, more equitable system. I know we always say with an equity lens, but really equity is at the center of this, whether you live in the suburbs or you live in Chicago. At the center of all of this is about people and how they can access opportunity in order to have a place where they can thrive and be their best selves. Again, when we're thinking about governance, efficiency does not equate equity. Sometimes you have to do things that are not efficient in order to make sure that the people who have needs are getting the resources they deserve. And so again, I want to look beyond what we're comfortable with, what the status quo is, how you want to protect your work or how you're perceived, and take a step back and say, well, if the ridership is not perceiving it to be the same way, what are we doing wrong, and how can we come back and make sure we're actually, again, centering people and centering equity in our conversation. Also, when it comes to innovation is not about perfection. Innovation is about taking risk, and it's also not about being careless. I think there's also a lot of conversation here where, if we do go to a new regional structure in which we kind of re-strategize how we want to do these three entities, that there's an inherent risk of being careless in that. And if anything, this report and what CMAP has shown is that they're actually very, very careful and very, very thoughtful with the information that they've brought us. And I think whatever suggestions or methodologies that we take back to the state legislature, we would be doing the exact same thing, having very tough conversations to come to consensus, right? Not that we will all agree, but that we go back and say, these are the steps that we would take to get to our north. I don't want us to be scared of the challenges that are coming before us. I agree with some of the points that my colleagues have made about understanding and finding a stable funding source. I think that's really important because, again, we can't get to governance unless we have a stable funding source, but then also being very bold in how we think about governance, because what is happening now is not working. I think many constituents throughout the region can agree it's not working. They're feeling that it's not working. And so how are we, again, responding to the fact that there are issues that need to be resolved? And I think being bold and thinking outside of ourselves, thinking outside of our individual neighborhoods, outside of our individual cities, and thinking about the region is a way to make all of our cities and neighborhoods stronger, not weaker. I don't want us to look at it as if we're losing something. We're gaining a community, a network of opportunity in changing the structure of how we're doing transit in the region today. So thank you.
Thank you, President Carter. And
thank you. I have a number of thoughts. I don't have any questions. I will echo what everyone has said earlier about the work that Aaron, you and your staff have done in putting this report together. I think it's a excellent job on a very difficult and complicated conversation. And I have certainly appreciated the opportunities that I have had to speak with you on this topic. And I certainly saw some of my quotable comments coming back to me in the presentations that we heard. So I was very pleased to see that. You know, you haven't heard a lot from the people who actually run the transit system in the meeting today. And I think it's really important that we make a few points. First of all, the complications of running our transit system should not be understated. I have a very different customer base and regulatory base than, say, Metra does. Merging those is a very complicated issue and should not be taken lightly, given the vast differences that exist between our various agencies. And I don't say that from the standpoint of having the type of regional service conversation that we're having. I do believe that that is important. And I think that we have made the point that I don't benefit from Metro or PACE failing. And I don't think Metro or PACE view that they benefit from CTA failing. We are a network. The reasons for why this network may not have been operating as well as it could have, to some of the comments that we've had, I would suggest is fundamentally tied to the funding and the way the funding has worked in this region since 1983. And I was listening to Jackie, and Jackie and I, over the years, have had many conversations about the funding and the way the funding was set up, the timing of when that funding was set up, which is its own set of history from an equity standpoint. And in particular, what the funding did to CTA. And one of the things that I think is important for the board to know is that RTA has never operated from a funding standpoint the way it was intended. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. There had always been a belief as part of the formula allocation for the funds in this region that there would be a discretionary pool of money that would be available to RTA to basically engage in discretionary decisions around how we operated our service, what should be prioritized, and everything like that. The truth of the matter is that that discretionary pool of money has always had to be allocated almost 98% to CTA because the formula never provided enough funding to support CTA's operations. And so when you look at a lot of what has happened over the history of transit in this region, the first thing you have to recognize is that RTA never did the complete picture of what it was supposed to do. And that isn't the fault of RTA, and isn't the fault of Leanne or any of the RTA board members. It's the reality of what the funding did that was set up by the legislature 40 years ago. So we never operated under the model that I think was intended to be operated. And as a result, you see a lot of the challenges that we're dealing with today. I kind of welcome the opportunity for having a revised conversation around this, because I think it's an opportunity for us to get it right. We didn't get it right in 1983. We talked about how we thought it was right. And subsequent to 1983, and unfortunately, I've been around for a lot of the other reforms that happened from that point forward, we never dealt with that. Instead, we just kind of found a way for what I refer to as kick the can, give us enough money to keep us going so we didn't have to come back down next year. And someday, one day, maybe we'd get to the point we could fix the fundamental problem. So the governance conversation to me is not just a conversation around governance for governance sake. It's a conversation around governance as it relates to the funding that was put into place. And at the end of the day, in my opinion, you cannot lose sight of the equity implications of everything that we do. I've made the point in numerous remarks that I've given over the years that a funding decision is an equity decision. And so ultimately, when we make decisions about what we're doing here and how this region is going to operate going forward, we need to keep sight of that as part of the overall conversation. The final point that I want to make, and it really goes to the question of the local aspect of the transit operations itself. We've heard a lot of conversation about, for example, bus service and how it could be improved with improved, bus lanes and things like that. I think it's important to recognize that the transit agencies don't own the streets. And if we're not working closely with, in my case, CDOT, for the most part, we're not able to implement the new bus networks and the frequency and everything that we're talking about. To some degree, I need for CDOT to have skin in the game with CTA in order for that to work. And so the governance models that we talk about have to be reflective of the fact that unless you're going to put control of the roads along with control of transit into one entity, you're not going to necessarily achieve the end results that you want. The final point that I would make to that regard, some of you in this room recognize that just last Friday, I had the opportunity to announce the final piece of funding for the Red Line extension, a piece of rail infrastructure that probably should have been built 30 years ago, but for any number of reasons didn't happen. That's going to go a long way to addressing some of the transit issues that we know exist in the southern part of Cook County, as well as in the southern part of the city. The other part that I don't talk about on Friday, but which was a critical part of what happened here, was the decision by the city to put in place a TIF to fund a significant portion of that project. And so we can't lose sight of the fact that at a local level, there are still significant decisions that are going to be made that have a significant impact on the projects that we pursue as transit agencies, and for whom the connection and responsibility for that transit system will continue to exist regardless of the governance structures we put in place. And we need to recognize that reality as we continue this conversation going forward. Whatever happens with governance, to be quite honest with you, is above my pay grade. I'm not the guy that's going to ultimately decide that, but I think it's important that if we don't learn from our past, we're doomed to repeat our mistakes in the future. We made mistakes in 1983. We have the opportunity to correct those mistakes now. And it's up to us to make sure that the decision makers who are going to make those decisions understand that they can't put us in the same position that we were in 1983 and have lived with for the last 40 years. Quite frankly, I'm surprised that we have a system as good as we do, given the challenges that we have faced. But I think that says a lot about the work of the transit agencies themselves to continue to work in spite of those financial hardships. And I'm looking forward to what's going to be a tremendous opportunity to reimagine what we're doing here in a way that's going to finally give us the opportunity to create the type of world-class transit system that this entire region should have. One that we will compare to systems like Madrid, London, Hong Kong, Paris. There's no reason we can't have a transit network that resembles what they do there. I've seen a lot of those networks, and I think that if we do this right, we will be in a position to do the same thing here in Chicago. Thank you.
Thank you. Mayor Noak?
Thank you very much. I want to start out by thanking the staff and the study team. I have no surprise that I asked a lot of questions, and sometimes it probably made some people uncomfortable, but I think this is too important not to ask questions. This is a time when we need to ask more questions if we're going to engage in something of this magnitude. we agree on many things. And I think that's important today, is that we probably agree on more than we disagree on. And I think we all want a better service for the region's riders. We want a more equitable system, but we also want it to be more equitable for the entire region. And that means people in my county, people in other Cali counties, it means people in the city. So we want to make sure that whatever we do, whatever we suggest, has that in mind as well. There's a lot of discussion, again, about regional service, but, as pointed out, the details matter. What one person's thought of regional service and better regional service is a lack of investment in somebody else's region. And so we need to always keep that in mind, that those details do matter. As for the governance structure, obviously, something I've already said myself is that I do prefer the second option. I believe that, as was just said, the RTA never got to do what it was originally envisioned to be able to do, and that we need to be looking to strengthen the RTA at this time. But I'm going to throw this out as well. I think that there is merit to this discussion about longer term further integration. So I think there's a spot in between both of those that still is yet to be explored. As we said, there was a sliding scale of governance. It's not necessarily one or the other. And so why shouldn't we look at a longer term discussion that truly engages the transit agencies in that discussion of consolidation over time and the things that may be really realistically need to happen in order for that to occur? One of the things right off the bat that this report points out is that we have some of the most efficient, we cannot lose track of that, agencies that are ready amongst all the peers. So we can't discount that either. About 3 to 7%, if I'm correct, of the region's population are transit riders. So we also need to remember that our 93 to 95% or 97% of the population are taxpayers that also need to be represented, though. They cannot be discounted. And of the percentage of those riders of that, 3 to 7% or 5 to 7% of the ridership that comes from of the region that rides, it's an even smaller percentage that actually takes more than one goes between the transit providers. So we also need to keep that in mind, that our entire focus cannot be just on the smallest of small percentage of riders that go between transit providers. We need to have a better service that interconnects, but we can't do it at the risk of giving up local flexibility, innovation. True innovation is already occurring. It's happening in all these transit agencies as we speak. You've already heard that. And so we can't give up one thing for another. So we have to find a balance to accomplish both of those things. And I'm glad that it was pointed out and brought up that the steering committee never voted on this. There was significant disagreement. I encourage anybody to watch the last steering committee meeting where there was a discussion on governance. There was quite a bit of significant disagreement. So let's not say that this committee leaned particularly anyway. We don't know. And as was already highlighted in a recent article in the Tribune, there was significant disagreement, and those individuals felt the need to go and become vocal on it. Further on in consolidation, as I kind of alluded to already, we need to see that the first option has significant hurdles. Yes, innovation's great, thinking forward's great, but we cannot discount the fact that combining everything into one operating agency has real significant issues, whether it be pension debt, because speaking on behalf of the Cali regions, I can tell you that is going to be a major concern, is to inherit further pension debt onto the taxpayers within the Cali counties. Also, there are significant labor contract issues that must be addressed into any further future consolidation of the agencies. This will take time. Also, I'll give you one small example. This is just one small example. And according to some of the information given to me by PACE, if we took PACE bus drivers and matched them to CTA bus drivers today on their pay rates, it would add another $30 million a year to the hole that we're already talking about. That one small change. So we cannot look at merging the agencies without the realistic notion that those things have costs and they take time. It's not that it's not a worthwhile goal. It is. In fact, I think that we should have that discussion, but we have to have it with our eyes open and asking all the questions. And that's why details matter. Also, I strongly agree with Leanne on the RTA strategic plan. I think we need to look at it as well for all the potential funding sources that are being considered. I think we need to broaden our scope and look at all the options and make sure the legislature is given all the potential options for funding that exist. The other thing we need to acknowledge is even with this funding, this plan does not address the state of good repair. It will take significantly more money to actually get the system to where it should be. I thought the notion given by the Will County executive was an excellent one. The idea of another referendum, let's let the taxpayers decide. Let's take it to them. Let's take it to the people who actually have to be a part and pay for this system. And we shouldn't just look at people who ride today. We need to look at people who have ridden in the past and may ride in the future. If our goal is to provide service that people want to be a part of, we have to engage those who are not a part of it now as well and make sure they are represented. So again, I want to thank the team. It was no easy task. I hope that my questions were just taken as questions, because I think that the team did as great of a job as they could, given the input, the constraints, and the time that they had. So thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I've got Jim Derwinski, Chair Conroy. I have a bunch of city folks. I might defer to Mr. Roberson afterwards, and then Chair Hart.
Thank you very much, and it's always a pleasure to follow President Carter and Mayor Noak here. Makes my comments a lot easier. We've always supported a better transit system, there's no doubt there. Have we had the financial stability, you would have it today. That's the real problem. President Carter brought up the problem of 1983, and that's just continued to haunt us for now 40 years. And it's shown in the fact that once we got COVID relief money and we weren't backed into a corner every single year to balance a budget, deciding, is it head count? Is it number of runs? Is it cutting back a service later in the night? Because we weren't backed in that corner, we've actually worked very well together to develop a lot of innovative things. I'd like to point out that it was pointed out earlier, unintended consequences. This is a complex situation. There are going to be unintended consequences, and that has to be really thought out. I'm sure in 1983, as pointed out, they thought they did the right thing. I'm sure in 2008, everybody thought they did the right thing, and yes, there was a housing problem right after that. But there are unintended consequences of some of the suggestions here. Our boards or our operating units have very, very different, unique operating characteristics. I don't get to run on IDOT roads. I don't get to run on CDOT roads. I have to run on 6 Class 1 railroads. You ever work with the Class 1s? You want a real problem? And I want to emphasize one more point, the capital investment. You know, we talk about whatever the state of good repair backlog is. Inside the report, it addresses capital investment. It is nowhere even near close to what needs to happen here. The General Assembly passing Rebuild Illinois, incredible. It didn't even put a drop in the bucket of the state of good repair backlog. If you want a world-class system, like what President Carter talked about, we need real investment, way, way beyond that. The 1890s bridges that we're operating on today, the 1977 locomotives, how about the 1953 cars they pull? These are all reality. That's going to take real investment. You want to electrify a system like the railroad? It comes at almost $1 billion for 5 miles. So when we talk about investment in the system we want, it has to include a good capital component. My last point, unintended consequences. We talk about, I've heard a lot today talking about service. PACE, CTA, I know. They're having a hard time hiring drivers. They're having a hard time hiring mechanics. Metro, we're at the same service level that we were pre-COVID. But our new challenge, and I'm sure the other service boards share this, we have a hard time recruiting and now retaining because of reports like this. This is an unintended consequence of doing this work. But when people look and say, hey, should I hire in at Metra? They're now second guessing and they're saying, what is Metra's future? So again, unintended consequences. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Hart. Great, Chair Conroy.
Thank you. Thank you, Aaron, and thank you for this report, and Aaron also for the, being accessible and really making this process as workable as you can. I really appreciate that. So a little questions and some comments. So if funding formulas were eliminated, how do you guarantee a level of funding for the service boards, especially in annual and multi-year budgeting? There's a need for formula-based consideration. Those formulas need to be revisited and modernized, not eliminated. I definitely echo what Mayor Rodering was saying. We have great potential to grow ridership to reflect changes in market conditions. Per the report, we have high local employment and limited transit availability. We strongly support fare integration. Better, faster bus service is critical to our existing and expanded markets. We fully support equitable governance. I feel a little bit like the first governance option was a lot more time was spent on that and kind of fleshing out what that might look like. Currently, I would say that we support the second governance model. And I'd like to see maybe a little bit more time spent on that so that it's a better decision-making process for everyone. So those would be our thoughts.
Great, thank you. And before I get to Chair Hart, Mr. Roberson, and then Chair Hart.
Thank you. I'm Baptist, and I'm going to say amen to all the comments that have been said about the work that the steering committee has done. I've had an opportunity to look through this. There's a lot of heavy lifting in here, a lot of heavy lifting. I am appreciative of the fact that in this room with Blankenhorn and Dorable and Sis and others, that we have people in the room who, and of course, Ms. Grimshaw, that we have in the room people who have witnessed the arc of the investment or lack of investment. I want to say to our regional partners on behalf of Mayor Johnson, the city is here and engaged and committed to regional collaboration. It doesn't do Chicago any good to do well if the rest of the region is doing badly. And so it is going to require the type of collaboration, and it is going to require really being bold in this moment. My son is 28, lives on the south side of Chicago, and I have two nieces who live in Round Lake. And as I'm asking them the question, and it becomes very personal as I'm sitting here, because it's very easy to get caught up in all the technical stuff. But I asked them, what is it going to take for you to want to remain in this region, to want to remain in Chicago? And their answers were pretty straightforward. I want to have a job that I'm passionate about. I want to have somewhere affordable to live. I want to find love. And I want the ability to be able to move around and get to where I need to go as easy as possible. And I think that we have to be mindful of looking at it through the eyes of, we are not building a system that many of us are going to be using. It is building a system over the next 20 to 30 years for my son and my nieces, for them to get from one part of this region to the other, to be able to get to jobs, to be able to get to education. And so it is really important, I think, that in this moment, that as we are having these considerations, that we not be scared of the moment, and that we step forward to it, and that we put forth the real tough questions. And yes, it's going to require, and it doesn't mean that we're all going to agree, but it is going to require us to figure out a way to get to yes. And so I want to make sure that everyone in this room understands that Mayor Johnson and his administration are committed to getting to yes. And we intend to bring the full force of our energy and our resources to this work, because to not do it, we already see what the price is. And so we need to make sure that we're doing absolutely everything possible, because our ability to create jobs, because it is about creating the denominator, right? We have a city of 2.7 million people that is built for a city of 4 million. We got to increase the denominator. We got to get people back into the city. We have to figure out a way that we can connect someone who lives in University Park to a job that's in Highland Park in an easy way that is accessible and inexpensive. So I appreciate all that has been done here. Thank you, Aaron. I realize that I am the new kid on the block, so but please know that we are here and we are ready to be committed to this work, and that I look forward to working and collaborating with each and every single person around the table.
Thank you. Chair Hart and Ann Sheehan.
Sorry, thank you so much. First, I also want to say thank you to Aaron and our CMAP team. They didn't visit us in Lake County once, but instead twice. So really appreciate your time and answering all of our questions. You know, I'm going to start sort of what my thoughts are, but of course I need to check with my entire board before we vote next month. But first, regarding taxing the services, you know, that sounds really scary, right? But you put in your report how there's certain services that we don't tax, and you came and spoke to us about this at Lake County. Services that state of Illinois doesn't tax, but surrounding states do. And, you know, we talk a lot, you know, I keep hearing equity, right? But that is something that is equity focused, right? If we keep increasing our taxes on goods, that is more regressive than taxing on services. We have to recognize that. I'm not saying I'm, you know, desperate to tax our services, but if we want to be equitable, then that's something that we really need to look at. And if our surrounding states are taxing some of these services and we're not, we have to look at it. I've heard myself, I think a couple people said, you know, the General Assembly will never pass it. I appreciate that the senators here and said, you know, we're ready to make tough decisions. So I look forward to hearing about some of those, but I think that's just a really important thing. As far as the governance, I so appreciate what Randy Blankenhorn had said. If we were to start today, what would it look like, right? And I think some of the reasons that I think we might be, at least for me and my colleagues, would be very concerned about that first model is because of maybe a loss of the Collier County voice, right? So, you know, what does that look like for us? As Mayor Rodering, who is our Lake County representative, was talking about, yeah, there's more opportunity. But again, if we look at it with an equity focus instead of an equal focus, then maybe there's some room there, right, in that first governance model. So I think that's kind of where I am. I get that it's hard, right? I mean, how many years we've been talking about this? It's hard, and that's why it hasn't been done. So I think there's a way to do that. About a year ago, I feel like we did the Chicagoland Economic Partnership meeting. That was really hard. We found out that the Chicagoland area was one of the few areas in the country we were way behind because we weren't working together and collaboratively. So we made a change. So I think we can get there. The only other thing that I had a question on, you talked about flexible funding within the report. That was interesting to me, of the federal and state highway funds to transit. Illinois is about 2%, California 10%, New Jersey 16%. You had some dollar figures in there. I was just interested in what CMAP's recommendation was in terms of that percentage, and I think we have to be really mindful. You know, the question was, is it a diversion of highway funds? I would argue that it is, right? So what that percentage is that CMAP is recommending there, and what the potential impacts are on our roads. And then, you know, does CMAP have a recommendation
if the General Assembly does say, yeah, we're not interested in taxing services, I think that's a huge bulk of the revenue that we're hoping to raise. So then what? So, thank you.
Thank you, Chair Hart. Just to the flexing of federal highway funds, as I sit next to my partner at the state, I think one of the considerations, we wouldn't necessarily want to just say like this percent, but that we're thinking about the corridors that we're doing it in and how flexing of funds could help solve multimodal problems together would be one of the ways that we would think about that. And I think we can get back to you on your last question that you had there. Ann Sheehan?
I just want to echo what everyone said, and thank you very much for all of your hard work on this very thoughtful and comprehensive report. My only comment that I wanted to add is under the section of bolstering public confidence. I certainly appreciate all of these recommendations, and the problems that we're working to address here are certainly big and complex, certainly bigger than the transit agencies who are working to address these problems. And so my comment is just that beyond these recommendations, I believe there needs to be a sustained collaboration and integrated strategies at a local level with our, as well as county and state, with our public safety partners, as well as our social service partners to really address these issues. So just wanted to include that on top of what you've recommended here.
Thank you. Recognizing that we are over our planned budgeted time, Chair Bueller.
I'll be brief, but I want to echo thank you for the CMAP staff and the steering committee for all the hard work you've done. Certainly a Herculean task to take this on at the behest of the state legislature. Just briefly, I don't want to repeat too much, but I don't think that the wheel is broken and needs to be completely rebuilt. I appreciate the interactions that we have with our local representatives. If McHenry County has a problem or see that there needs to be additional things done in the county, I feel very free to call up our PACE representatives as well as Metra. And we've worked some of those issues out very, very nicely over the last couple of years that I've been in office. So I don't think it needs to be reinvented. We do recognize that in order to tackle the pressing regional problems, we need to strengthen and reimagine the role of the RTA. The county is not in favor of consolidating all the service boards into one regional entity, which would not fit the unique history and context of the Chicagoland region. For this reason, we would ask that the final part report remove a reference to unified regional entity and only recommend a strengthened and re-envisioned RTA. The board appointments to this new RTA should not dilute the voices of suburban residents who feel underrepresented in the transit decision-making policies today. And as far as funding goes, we do understand that a combination of new tax revenues and fare increases will be necessary to maintain the region's stability, transportation stability. I am strongly opposed to a state sales tax to include services. I do believe that businesses will be at a competitive disadvantage, and I don't know if that's equitable for those people that need jobs, and not just a disadvantage locally or regionally, but nationally and globally as well. So I think we do have to consider that. I don't think it would be popular in Springfield. I'm fairly certain that our local representatives in Springfield aren't going to be in favor of this, so I'm certainly not in favor of a tax on services. So, but thank you for your time.
Any other comments from the committees? With that, I think we'll.
Yes. With that in mind, yes, I want to thank all the board members and those in the audience who have stayed to listen to the discussion. That's what this was all about. I'm getting a signal here. Any other business? Any other business? And there is open to public comment. Is there somebody up there? Go ahead.
It does look like someone with an iPhone online has asked for public comment.
Hi, everybody. It's Garland Armstrong, formerly of Des Plaines, now living in Des Moines, Iowa, along with Heather Armstrong. How's everybody doing?
We're good.
Yeah, I just would like to comment on three things, and then my wife want to say something. I want to, number one, I want to commend for everyone, including the business and the federal, to make sure to be ready for 2026. God forbids what will be happening, especially with the fiscal cliff, because I think that's going to be a major issue. And I think everyone, the federal, the state, the business, stakeholders, everybody should be all extremely get together, well prepared for this, because God forbid, like I said when I was there, only time will tell what will happen when 2026 comes around. So I think everyone should be batten down the hatches, because when 2026 comes, the reality will be coming right toward them like a lightning and thunder, and then they are not extremely well prepared for it. And number two, my also concern is I want to, especially what is happening right here in Des Moines, especially some of the electric buses for PACE and CTA. I hope you're extremely well prepared, because to have a backup plan, because here they said the manufacturing here for DART buses has filed for bankruptcy, and I hope the PACE buses and the CTA buses should be well prepared to have a backup plan if that goes into effect, and also maybe some of the Metro parts too, if they file for bankruptcy. So I hope Metro will be extremely well prepared too for it. If some of the manufacturers file for bankruptcy, can Metro also have a backup plan for it too? Because that's my biggest concern for it. And also number three, I want to commend the mayor of Highland Park. What happened last year, me and Heather used to live in Des Plaines, and we used to come through Highland Park when there was an MS education event. So I'm glad you're keeping Highland Park strong. And whenever we come back again in the Chicagoland area, we'll come by through Highland Park area. And since we'll be, as visitors, seeing how things have changed since we left. And after Heather speaks, we'll be glad to have any comments or questions from y'all. Hold on, my wife wants to say something too.
Thank you, Garland.
Hello, my name is Heather Armstrong. I used to live in Des Moines, Iowa, and I think one way that you could fund like transit would be with like something more secure than sales taxes, because sales taxes are not that secured, because at certain regions they could go up to the surrounding states and buy stuff there where the taxes are a lot less, especially with Cook County with the 11% sales tax. So I figured like try like corporate taxes and also real estate taxes, especially for public transit.
Thank you.
Any questions or comments from the committee or the board members? We'll be glad to answer it for y'all.
I don't see any hands up, Garland, so thank you. You and Heather, thank you very much.
Our
All right.
pleasure.
With that in mind, we have two motions, one by myself and one by the Secretary of Transportation to adjourn the meeting. With that in mind, I'll entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Moved and second, all in favor, signify in usual manner. Motion carried, meeting adjourned. Mr. Secretary.
That was fast.
See if you can do it faster. Go.
Okay. Motion to adjourn.
MPO motion members. Yeah.
For adjourn.
All right. MPO is adjourned. I want to remind everybody that the next meeting is scheduled for Wednesday, October 11th in this room at 1:30, a different time, but we wanted to move it so that service boards could have their board meetings. So thank you. Comments by, there's food. Grab some food on your way out.